Once more unto the breach, dear friend. Once more, or close the wall up with our English dead. In peace, there's nothing so becomes a man as modest stillness and humility. But when the blast of war blows in our ears, then imitate the action of the tiger. Stiffen the sinews, summon up the blood, disguise fair nature with hard-favoured rage. Then lend the eye a terrible aspect. Let it pry through the portage of the head like the brass cannon. Let the brow o'erwhelm it as fearfully as doth a galled rock, o'erhang and jutty his confounded base, swilled with a wild and wasteful ocean. Now set the teeth and stretch the nostril wide, hold hard the breath and bend up every spirit to his full height. On, you noblest English, whose blood is fed from fathers of war-proof, fathers that, like so many Alexanders, have in these parts from morn till even fought, and sheath their swords for lack of argument. Dishonour not your mothers. Now attest that those whom you called fathers did beget you. Be copying out of men of grosser blood, and teach them how to war. And you, good yeomen, whose limbs were made in England, show us here the mettle of your pasture. Let us swear that you are worth your breeding, which I doubt not, for there is none of you so mean and base that hath not noble lustre in your eyes. I see you stand like greyhounds in the slips, straining upon the start. The game's afoot. Follow your spirit, and upon this charge, cry God for Harry! Harry! England! England! And St. George!
Good evening. Hello, everybody. Happy St. George's Day to one and all. Englishmen everywhere, rise up in the spirit of Henry V. Today, we are going to be discussing George and the Dragon. And with me, I have three very fine fellows to help me do this great and noble task. First up, I have, returning once again, Scott Mannion. Hello, Scott. How are you doing?
Hello. How are you?
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
Oh, that's very rousing. I think it's Laurence Olivier, was it? And I think first time I've heard that, I prefer that over the more recent 1980s speech of the same thing. But yeah, it's very spurring intro.
That was Richard Burton's version of it, actually.
Richard Burton, yeah.
He just captures that role so well. I felt like I wanted to go into the breach at that moment.
Yeah, I think it's very naturalistic though for its time, because usually films of that time are quite on the nose with the speeches, but that's how it seems it would have sounded when the yell to charge would have been at the time, right? Not that perhaps if it was in those exact words, but in the play at least. Yeah, very good.
Are you ever tempted, Scott, to make a good St. George film of some kind?
Yeah, I mean, film was something I might come back to. I saw, because, you kind of commit career suicide when you enter this space in a way. But
certainly
George,
not.
perhaps a Shakespeare, definitely, yeah. But it's a very large subject to approach. So you want to be able to do it justice, right? So you need a really good lead actor. You need to be able to direct actors, because directing actors is a particular skill as well. It's not Michael Bay can't direct actors. You need to have done acting, right? Which I've done, drama classes, because or else you just don't know what to say to them. You give them result directions or be more evil, and they don't know what to do with that. You have to give them something that's workable, an image, or anyway. I won't go into the detail on that, but yeah. All these historical films are great. They're just very expensive. Period dramas, really, the costumes, all that stuff is, but that's what England's always been so good with, because all the locations are free, right? You don't have to build sets. Yeah.
Well, I always think of like Monty Python and the Holy Grail, and it's all just like local castles around here that they went to. They're just perfect sets for everything they were doing. Yeah, it sounds like though, if you're struggling for a lead actor, you should just do the Orson Welles thing and just direct yourself. Well,
in a sense, that's what my channel is. It's me getting sick of having to deal with other people and degenerate filth in Los Angeles and actors or whatever. I'll just do it. I'll be in front of camera, because that's where the power is, right? You really just get, in a sense, you get exploited by middlemen, really, if you can't get yourself in front of camera in a way. And you see a lot of directors doing that now, like Kevin Smith having their own podcast, right? Because they know that's where the power is. So yeah. Acting's hard though. To direct and act at the same time is difficult, but it's something that can be done. Yeah.
Yeah, well,
yes, I like historical pieces. It's something I love to do past one day, but it's something I might revisit one day. It's not. I'm not directing things at the moment. Haven't in a long time, so doing this is a little different. You know.
Oh yeah, and well, we can all hope that St. George will reach our screens one day.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, welcome to the show, Scott. Good to have you back.
Thanks, man.
Let me introduce my two other guests tonight. So returning to English Restoration, our loyal co-host, it is Rupert August. Hello, Rupert. How are you doing?
Hello, doing well. Happy St. George's Day.
Happy St. George's Day, Rupert. Have you done anything to celebrate today?
No, I must admit I haven't. I've been rather bad about it in one way, in that I've spent most of the day sort of working on a last-minute essay entry for a competition. Well, yeah, to be published perhaps. But we'll see.
Oh, fantastic! Well, fingers crossed for that. I'll let you off on that case then. Yes, is there a particular version of Henry V's speech that you like?
That one was quite good, but there's something that was markedly missing for me, which I've somewhat experienced in real life, so I kind of notice it missing, which is that the sort of rousing cheer at the end just does not quite have the same gravitas when it's missing a few hundred at least voices.
Yeah, or a few thousand added.
Well,
just
yes,
needed more extras, yeah. Oh well, maybe when Scott does his version, we'll have 3,000 based people cheering at the end. That'll work.
And we'll kill the enemies of England on camera. It won't be fake. Just kidding. Just
Minecraft, yeah. Great. Well, we may have somebody ready for the part, I think, here, because our final guest tonight, it's his first appearance on the show. Please welcome Matt, aka Nord Hugo. Hello, St. George.
I see you,
Thanks.
gentlemen, you Englishmen on the field of battle. I see the fire in your hearts as you yearn for victory. Remember to cry out for the King, for England, and for St. George. Well, hello,
It could be an
everyone.
honorary one.
Hello, and welcome back to another edition of the Nathan C.J. Hood Show. We've got a great show for you here today. And with that, on to you, Nathan.
Oh, thank you, Matt. That was beautiful. I think that's your first audition, Scott. You've got already somebody putting themselves forward.
You're hired. You're hired. There's that American brinkmanship. He's hired, man.
So Matt, I know this is your first time on. So for folks who don't necessarily know you on this channel, can you say a little bit about what you do on your wonderful, excellent channel?
Hey, thank you. Yeah, great to be on. Great to be on with a great panel. Yeah, on my channel, Nord Huger, I produce videos, occasionally some live streams, but primarily videos based on analyzing media, analyzing mythology and stories in history focused around Northwest European and Scandinavian history. And so, yeah, just put out a video this last week on the 1958 Disney film, The Island at the Top of the World. And yeah, so I love to kind of look back. So it's great that you played one of these beautiful classic speech clips, because there's a power in some of the older media that you don't get. There's a courage and a conviction of heart from some of these older productions and actors when they're, you can tell that it's more, in some ways, more real to them.
I agree. I think you definitely feel like when I watch Orson Welles play Falstaff, I believe he actually loves the character and he understands the character in a way that many modern productions they don't have any sympathy for that kind of character. We all know why they don't, because they want to deconstruct them and destroy them. So I totally agree with you that even if you disagree with some of the interpretations or the ways they do it, there's a real affection for the parts that they're playing, and that speaks to the audience sort of in ways we're not used to, I suppose, today. But yeah, and I can't praise highly enough Nord Huger's channel. I remember you've done some great kind of documentary style things on like berserkers, for example, which was just fascinating, and connected it with modern day examples of what could be like a berserker. So yeah, everybody should check out Nordhuger's channel, and especially that most recent video. Gentlemen, is there anything else you would like to promote before we get into St. George and the Dragon?
Just St. George.
Just St. George.
Yeah. Just based Englishman, St. George.
Oh, well, okay. Well,
Rupert, I guess Rupert's not responding. I want to promote Rupert August's channel, the most base essays. Whatever. Anyway, I'm sure that's probably what he was going to say, right?
Thank you. Well, mostly just stream appearances at the moment. So recently did a stream with Semi-Agog on Japanese intelligence apparatus, the Imperial Japanese intelligence apparatus and secret societies. Pretty fascinating topic.
That sounds pretty
Is that
awesome.
on your channel?
No, it's on Semi-Agog's channel.
Can you give us a sneak preview of what we might discover there about these?
I'm hooked.
Secret societies.
Yeah, they were pretty extensive, and one of the main sort of features was that essentially they were acting as the something like a engine for influence and for sort of control over certain factions, but doing so out of the pocket of private citizens, patriotic citizens. So the government was essentially able to draw on all of this information and all this spying, basically just from people going out and doing it themselves and then reporting back to the government. I think it's probably the way that I've thought about it or contextualized it is that it's something like the total war state, but applied to intelligence instead.
That sounds fascinating, and I feel like there's parallels to today in various ways.
Well, in this case, obviously, we're kind of it almost acts as a crossing point in a certain number of ways as well, because one thing that sort of jumps out is that they are able to sort of jump on this general cultural atmosphere in most of the West of a lot of trust, basically. Like they enter a high trust society and then exploit the hell out of it. So they could just go up to any random officer, like a military officer, especially in the early days, and say, "Hey, could you show me around your military dockyard and give me a rundown of the ship that you're part of and explain how everything works?" And they would do it because, why not?
They were too noble,
as
it were. Yeah, they didn't have our cynicism.
Yeah,
I guess
exactly. It's where it seems to be where some of that sets in this kind of period, and I can't help but see a link that's not explicitly mentioned, but I think it's there.
It sounds like there was that German filmmaker that went to China, and he thought, I'm only going to get through this checkpoint if I just completely act like I'm meant to be here. And he just walked up to them as if they didn't matter at all, these Chinese checkpoint military men, and they just let him pass. And this is in 1960s or 70s China, right? So there is that probably, I suppose, that's similar, the same thing. I only half heard that, but yeah, it's this Asian deference to authority. And for some reason, he was just a Westerner. And this is in heavy communist times, though, as well. And they just let him through. Interesting psychology difference between the East Asian.
I think in the case of the Japanese, there's another component where quite often they would be pretty forward about what they're looking for, and they'd be guided through anyway, because there's just a trust. You just do someone a favor like that because it's the polite thing to do in a way. I don't know. Maybe too naive in sort of like Western circles, and they had quite a lot of honor about them and a lot of honesty.
Well, speaking of honor and honesty, we have the story of St. George, and what I thought before we get into the actual contents of the story itself, St. George and the Dragon, it might be worthwhile looking at a bit of the history around the legend and its historical influences. The main kind of gateway of George and the Dragon comes through the Golden Legend, which is a text written in the 1260s. And this is how it becomes kind of introduced into Western Europe and ties in quite nicely with a lot of the Romance literature going around at the time of various knights on quests and so on, and we'll get into some of that. But I wanted to, so that's where the story really comes from in its most famous version, and I think in the 16th century as well, it was one of the first texts that was printed. So it's one of the first texts to have kind of mass dissemination in that period as well. So that kind of helps to embed St. George as a popular figure or an accessible figure. But gentlemen, there are many influences, and I know you all have various thoughts on the influences of this story or comparisons and so on. So I just want to open it up to you guys about the history of it.
Yeah, the thing I found just straight off the back of what you mentioned with the Golden Legend one is that I found the earliest sources of that particular story is one in Georgia, I think, which is 11th century. But what I found so interesting about that is that there's no spearing of the dragon, right? There's no spearing of it. So he prays to God to do it. So you can see here perhaps the interaction of when it moves over into Italy, which was taken over by the Goths, right? We know that that's at that point. So there was a push down, right? It's not exactly the same population as it was in Roman classical days, right? So what happens is when you get to that golden text is that he is spearing the dragon. So there's a big difference between that. One is a dragon slayer, and one who is a person who goes there, prays to God to remove the dragon, right? And there is a source, I can't remember if it is, I can't remember if it's Spengler. I think it might be Spengler who says that the Semitic dragon slaying is God slays it. The Indo-European and or Hyperborean version it's the individual hero that does it, that slays a dragon. So perhaps speculating there, the difference between that when it moves over from east to west is the individual spearing it himself, right? Not without God. God's giving the individual the ability to do it, whereas the East is different, right? It's not empowering the hero, because we're very much the hierarchy, as Carlyle calls it. This hero worship is very powerful, and it's as we know, it's an Indo-European dragon slaying is a very important Indo-European motif or way of being. So that's just one thing I found. The spearing, the actual individual slaying doesn't happen until it seems to be that golden text. Once it's in Italy, yeah.
Well, Nathan, you've talked about Chaos Camp. I mean, do you see that as kind of connecting to what Scott's saying?
Yeah. I mean, so the Chaos Camp motif in kind of ancient Middle Eastern religions is that you have a primordial kind of situation with some sort of monstrous being who presides over that order. So Tiamat would be a good example of this, the monstrous feminine, who the warrior god Marduk must slay. And in slaying, he then uses the corpse to form a new order, the one that we know. And so we are essentially dependent upon Marduk's victory over Tiamat. We are his subjects, we are subordinate to him, we're contingent on it. And if she rises back up again, she's a threat to our existence because she's a threat to his reign. And you see that motif in a number of different places. So you could interpret like Odin slaying Ymir and then using his corpse to form the universe as a version of this. You've also got Zeus essentially overthrowing Kronos. It's slightly different, but you can see there's a parallel there. Certainly some scholars have made that suggestion. And of course, these are all gods slaying monsters, right? So I think that's a good connection to make. We do have, though, maybe small scale versions of this, and I think this, but it's not the same. So like Perseus slaying Cetus, which parallels the St. George story quite closely, insofar as there was a queen of Ethiopia who made a boast that she was more beautiful than these supernatural beings, and Poseidon was angered by this, and he floods the region, and he sends Cetus to go and attack it, this great sea monster, the sea being the kind of chaos or the opponent of the ordered world. I think that's a better way to put it. And so the king goes to the oracle, to the priest, and asks, what can I do to appease this? And he tells him, you must sacrifice your daughter to the sea monster, and then he will depart. He will no longer attack you. So he does this, and this is Andromeda. But at that moment, Perseus arrives. Perseus, the slayer of Medusa, and he's been blessed by the gods in various different ways. He has the magical sword, he has the helmet, he has the winged boots which help him fly. And with his magical sword, he is able to slay Cetus, rescue the girl, and completes the hero's journey. So you do have that in the ancient world, but it's a Greek story. So is it really? Have we moved away from the more Middle Eastern gods Chaos Camp? I don't know, but it's not the same as the Chaos Camp, I think, because it doesn't establish a new order. It restores the order, but it's not a new order.
Would you say that Chaos
Camp one seems like it's cosmological, the primordial waters of outside of time, where the first chief god, Tiamat, being slain by Marduk, right? It's very primordial rather than the sort of individual hero that's in an established world that already exists. I think perhaps you could see the Thor slaying of the dragon is probably cosmological, but still in an established order where it happens, even at the end, right? So perhaps that's closer. But I think there is a slight difference between these cosmological pre-time narratives where the primordial snake is slain, than these ones where you're in a world, a dragon rises, and it's slain again by the people that are in the order. What do you think?
Yeah, it's a smaller environment in which it's taking place in, and it's not creating a new one, but it might be transforming it or reestablishing it in some way. It's not kind of the foundations of being itself at stake. Matt, you were going to say something.
Oh, just that. Yeah, I think Scott brings up a great point that you have the cosmological, and then you have the in time, in history events and figures. So you have the Siegfried and Fafnir, you have the Beowulf and the dragon, you have Jason and the Cerberus, although that's going back to the Greek. And there is this kind of these are the men who embody the cosmic. So you have the macro scale, and then you have the micro that kind of reflects what's going on at the cosmological.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because these heroic figures, certainly if you take a kind of Evolian interpretation, and I think Spengler is kind of on the same lines with this in some ways, is that in the ancient myths, they're usually descended in some way from the divine, right? They usually have some kind of usually it's Zeus who's parented somebody along the way, and so like Hercules, for example, is a descendant of Zeus, right? And in various versions, is not Siegfried a descendant of Odin? And so I think these characters are in themselves a bridge between the divine and the human. They are the pontifex, they are the bridge, and they reflect the divine in the human world by their heroic actions. There's a kind of whereas in perhaps medieval literature, the human is not quite the same in that they're in search for the divine. They are going for the Grail. They're hunting for the Grail. They're going towards the place of the divine. They don't have it within themselves. So that might be
inborn. It's initiation. It's one is more about expedition initiation. The other is about being birthed by Hercules, because there's a hierarchy of heroes and a hierarchy of gods. Hercules is Zeus, but he's demigod. He's half, right? Whereas St. George is human and becomes canonized. So he's lifted into heaven. That's what canonization is. It's making you. It's saying, well, really, it's noticing that someone already is a hyper agent. He's already in heaven when he was dead. So, in terms of seeing it symbolically, if you're a materialist, see it as the unconscious. Is that he's such a powerful figure that this enters into the unconscious and becomes deified in that way. But as the Christians see it, it's you're in heaven and affecting world, and you can pray to that demigod, I suppose you could call it, or hyper agent, and it will give you favor. Like when you're playing the Warhammer games and you go for the Imperium, and then the Emperor gives you, just for people who don't understand this stuff, right? You do that and you get an enchantment, and then you have a benefit in battle, right? That's how it works. Anyway, go on.
I love it. Rupert, is there anything you wanted to bring in at this point?
Yes, there was a point. We've sort of gone a little bit past it now, but the point that was originally made about praying to God to intervene and slay the dragon on your behalf versus doing it yourself. There is a noteworthy section in a version of the story that I've read where there's sort of like two things going on. In one case, in one sense, it is George directly slaying the dragon himself, but this is after he has already been sort of attacked twice by the dragon, and then is then only protected essentially by divine intervention, more or less. And so, in thanks of that, in the middle of the fight, when the dragon can't continue to attack him, he kneels down in prayer, and then after that, after he said that thanks, he then goes back to taking on his more personal duty. And I think that, like the meeting of these two things is, for one thing, quite interesting, but also potentially illustrates. I mean, you could probably draw out some of the symbolism of all this. The positive action of the individual versus this sort of like putting it in God's hand, protection that is the divine protection that is afforded, but also the sense in which this is not necessarily a unified phenomenon. It is not entirely in George's hands 100% in all versions of the more anglified version of the tale. I wonder how many other versions of the story there are where perhaps more of it is put in God's hands and it's more in line with the, as you described it, the Semitic sort of version of this tale.
Yeah, when I say individual, I don't mean that Descartes radical subject where it's just the individual. Yeah. I mean God's working through him 100%.
Yes. Yeah, of course.
In these legends, yeah. Because I don't want to make this case that England is this atheist place. It's just not true. It's working through. I think it's just more emotive of the God is giving you this power. Like the Emperor, enchanted space marine can now slay the thing because he's given this power, rather than saying like that, God, please say like Ashk in back in Judaism, praying for Yahweh to intervene, and then Yahweh goes, a lightning bolt comes down. No, it's that God gives it, and then that's how I see it anyway. So are we gonna you're gonna tell the sorry, Rupert, go.
But I mean there is also a slight difference in the way in which you're kind of like falling back on free will to a certain extent. And you're kind of like you might imbue the individual with power, like the individual might be imbued with divine power in this case, to carry out the act. But in terms of protection, that is more a fallback of more direct divine intervention. So the divine intervention is not completely invisible to the subject, to only sort of give thanks through faith. It's still there and it's still very visible. But when one's own sort of like will is being brought into the equation, that is something which can be backed up divinely rather than just being put straight into divine hands.
Yeah, certainly I think that with us at least, or when it comes into our tradition, the yes or no is very important to the person, because that's essentially what we have. We have a decision between attractors that approach us in life, and where we can either say yes to the one that is virtuous or yes to the one that's vice. It's not, I don't believe in that full free will, because you are affected by things that are in your past and various things. But you can say yes or no. That's our gift, right? Is to say yes or no. So you given this divine power, perhaps, and you say yes, and you get more of it as you move towards the light, right? Saying yes, yes, yes that way. So yeah, I think that's the internals, I suppose, of these legends, as Rupert articulates for our side as it moves over to the West and across the Channel.
I guess as well, you could see the difference in that. Perhaps the difference is one of the monk or priest as opposed to the knight. They are both, they're both legitimate ways of relating to the divine, but one is in, typically a kind of peaceful, passive, perhaps in certain degree, like allowing the divine in through contemplation, meditation, acts of charity, etc. In certain ways. Whereas the knight is a much more active manifestation of that same phenomenon. But they are, so they're both agents of God, but they're directed in different ways. And perhaps the Georgian version is like the monk version of George, the Western version is like the
Yes,
knight
yeah.
version of George.
That's right. No,
Yeah.
that's what I felt about it when I was looking into this. I have several times, but because often when you're not canonized, he's not canonized for slaying the dragon. That's something that is imbued as it goes west, I think. He's canonized for most saints aren't canonized for slaying things or slaying people, right? They're canonized for acts of faith or being martyred, aren't they? So it's very different. And this is where I would make the case. I don't know if I should get into it now, but it's a different George. It is a different George. And this is an English George, or at least a Northern European George, as a hyper agent. It's selected by this thing. I won't go too deep into that because I'll just monopolize the conversation, but I'll just throw it back. What do you think of that?
Well, Matt, I know you were saying to me earlier that you thought that the two Georges actually have, there's a continuity between them in some ways. So I want to put you two into combat here.
Sure. It's an important question because, as to the origins of St. George, you could say that, Greek, born in Turkey, modern day Turkey, but you can see in the way that he plays out his life with the heroic charge into battle, but also with his martyrdom. You see something that ties into a very distinctly Northwest European view of battle and death, which is this sort of long defeat. It's the triumph in not only going out and slaying the monsters that have come to attack the village. I mean, in that way, very reminiscent of Beowulf. It has that same sort of energy to it, but it also comes with the sense of triumph through death. That death is part of the process of the heroic. That death is part of the experience by which glory is attained, really, and it's through that journey, and it's through the whole process, and it's through this embrace, in many ways, embrace of death as this glorious, triumphant path to heaven, that we really see, I think, something that fits very well in with the English spirit. And maybe that's more universal, and as I'm sort of thinking through it, that resonates very much with Christianity in and of itself, as it has this very strong martyrdom belief that's embedded in it. But I think maybe the reason why this feels so distinctly Northwest European and English is because the English, even when they were off and astray from Christianity, even when they were pagan, they never strayed so far that was distant from them, that this understanding of death as this process by which one reaches Valhalla, by which one reaches the state of glory and achievement beyond themselves, that's never something that was ever lost. And I think the story of St. George resonates so much perhaps with the English, and is so distinctly English, is because it has that throughout its heart. But what do you guys make of that? I mean, you guys are the Englishmen here, so I'll throw that to you.
Well, I would say, I'm just going to jump in. I would say that, okay, so when you have George, I think he's selected by something that's in English being, hyper agent or whatever. It just suits what it is. And it's almost a way. There are stories of Richard going to the Crusades and selecting George when he goes to St. George's. There are accounts of this. So let's just take it that happened. So Richard was someone that was said to have carried around Excalibur. He actually called it Excalibur, and these are people that are versed in these narratives, right? So there's a connection between Arthur and St. George in that way. He selects St. George. This is a way, though, of selecting something that is canonized after he wins a battle over there. He selects George because Arthur isn't canonized. You need a hyper agent, which is in heaven, that's with your battle in the Crusades. And so that's kind of the birth of the English flag as well, when this is selected. And then later on, after that, he comes back, and they say that these stories of George came with the Crusaders that came back to England after that, right? And so later on down the chain, you have Edward III, who founds the Order of the Garter. And that's based on St. George as well. But also it's Arthurian Round Table. This is inspired by the same sort of thing. But again, Arthur is not a canonized thing. So it seems to me that you have this thing that's selecting what suits it already. Perhaps that is, perhaps that's Thor, you could say, in a way. It's a dragon slaying being or hyper-agent that content suits. That content, because as Jung talks about, an archetype, it picks the content that it suits and says, great, that's me, right? And this is something that's acceptable. This canonized figure, right, is acceptable. And I'm not saying that can't be added to and changed. That hyper-agent has things come into its dynamic system, if you want to call it, and that's selected, right, and adds to it in some way, right? Because as we say, as Christianity adds hope to Ragnarok, it has a hope, or the universe isn't destroyed. It's a new sort of emergent feature, you could say, when you add these things together. And so when you see that, I would say there's evidence of this when you look at the Hofstede Cultural Comparison Index, which is like a bulk. This is a social scientific, psychological, you might have heard of this before, where it compares all cultures, but they have done, it's quantitative, right? So when you get England, so this is where I want to make the case for the English St. George, even different from the Scandis, right? So when you compare these countries, England's higher in individuality than all of Europe, which masculinity higher than all of Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Finland, right? And individuality. And higher than most of them in tolerance of the unknown, dragon slaying, right? Tolerance of the unknown. But the Scandis are quite high in tolerance of the unknown, but they're lower in those other two things. The Germans are high in masculinity, but they're low in tolerance of the unknown, right? So these things come together. So when I say individuality, I mean, with the English, we like our hierarchies. We like it's all for the sake of the king. It's for the sake of the hierarchy. It's not individualism gone wild like America. It's for the sake of the king. It's heroarchy. It's heroism, not individualism, right? And so you can see in that bulk measure that there is this unique thing. It's the masculinity, which means competitiveness. It means wanting to get to the top of the hierarchy, right? High in that, whereas all the other Europeans are lower, except the Italians. They're high in masculinity, but low in tolerance to the unknown, tolerance to uncertainty, right? So high masculinity with the southern Mediterraneans, but they're low in that. So this unique, and here's some proof of that. What muddling through? We know what muddling. We'll muddle through. That's us. We're very tolerant to that, right? Being exposed to that. Another, it's called in Australia, she'll be right. She'll be right. We'll muddle through. That means that when you have the unknown approach, you don't just go, oh no, we can't, like a German. You don't go, we have to, we need the system, licht aber. No, right? It's more, we'll figure out a way. We'll muddle through, right? It's tolerance to the unknown. And that uniquely suits an expeditionary soul. Expeditionary, because that's what St. George is. He arrives from the outside, comes to this village, does his thing. What that really is dragon slaying. It's Britain will rule the waves. It's the mastery, because ultimately the dragon is in the water. In this story, the dragon's in the lake, right? That's where the highest unknown is. And so it's really part of the national ethos. I'm not saying these places, by the way, don't have this. It's Northern European. I'm not saying they don't have it. I'm saying, like, in a value hierarchy, it's not just about having the value. It's about how high, how energetic it is. And so I would say it's these unique characteristics are more energetic, or the most energetic, in England. And we have a unique claim, and that's why it's selected for as the patron saint, because it's something that's in being. What do you think of that?
Well, and where do English explorers go? I mean, Scandis, when they have explored historically, they've traveled all around, but they're still generally staying in climates that for the most part are more akin to what they're used to. Whereas in a way that's totally unprecedented, the English, you do get cases like trading routes down through Iraq, but in terms of what the English are known for, in an unprecedented way that no other group on earth is like, the English go to the environments that are most hostile. They go out to South Africa, Rhodesia. They go out to the Wild West. They go out to the deserts of Australia. They go out to they explore through the Congo. You know, they're going to these places that they're ideally suited for it because of those combinations of traits, to be in this place that is foreign to the environments that they're used to and foreign to the way of life, but they are capable of thriving in the unknown and thriving in these spaces that you would think would be totally alien to them. But yet you see them kind of rise to the challenge as they're on activating all their gears.
I don't
mean,
want to.
more than that, though.
I agree, but I don't want to. I just don't want to talk down the Dutch either, because the Dutch are very low, very high in tolerance to the unknown as well. They're just not as masculine and competitive. So they go Dutch East Indies. That does explain the Dutch East Indies and all this stuff too. So I just want to say that I don't want to talk down the Scandies as well, because a lot of them are low in that unknown thing. Sorry, Rupert, I cut you off. Go.
Well, I mean, the Dutch are quite similar to English in a lot of ways, including if you're going by, especially connecting Frisians to Anglo-Saxons. There's quite a lot of commonality there. But anyway, the other point that I was going to make is so not only is there a tendency to sort of go to and map out these most inhospitable of places, but also turning basically everywhere into a garden of some sort.
Right. I mean, they were successful. They were long-lasting in their achievements in a way that you don't see quite so much with the Spanish, or, again, with the Scandies, much to my ire. One day we will we'll carve our own turf here on North America. But anyway.
Yeah, I mean, we Australia is probably one of the best examples, because we go to this place that is famously inhospitable, basically a giant desert, and turn it into this like massive bread basket, and one of the almost terraforming quite large portions of the country into English fields, more or less, somehow.
And you're so right there, but too, because there's Henry and Lawson were two British explorers that were looking for more land, and they went out to a place called the Blue Mountains. And I read the account of this, and it just felt like these guys, the way to describe it is that they were on the edge of the very hell. And they said, this place looks like the apocalypse. It looks like the very gods themselves threw thunderbolts down to carve out. When you look at the photos, it's exactly like that. I've been there. So it looks like someone's gone like this and ripped out these, like the Grand Canyon, but kind of more craggy and worse. So there is that inhospitability, hostility. Yeah. You know the word I'm trying to say. Inhospitability. I can't even say it.
Inhospitability.
Inhospitability. Yeah.
There we go. I think you're all right that there is this strong desire to conquer the inhospitable, to explore and conquer the inhospitable places, to civilize them, and to make them into almost setting your boundaries, or building a new settlement in a place where nobody thought it was possible before. And that requires the conquest of the chaotic, monstrous forces, such as the dragon. But I think the other side of that, and I think Rupert's comment on it, building gardens or cultivating gardens out of these wastelands is quite interesting, because if you think of what St. George is doing, he's not just fighting the dragon for its own sake. He's also doing it to protect a community and thus bring it back to life, essentially renew it, set it on the right path. And when you look at like the settler kind of frontier myth, when these pioneers go out, they're not just doing it for themselves, they're doing it so that they're civilizing the barbaric, chaotic forces to provide for the security, safety, and comfort for their communities. And I think that's a key part of this being, this kind of English being, which relates to St. George.
Yes.
Is that there's certain ideals that are relational, tied in with the individual heroic conquest, that perhaps in other cultures, like I don't see that so much in kind of Greek stories of like Perseus, for example. He does it to win the girl. He doesn't really do it for the kingdom. When Norse fights Jorgmander, it's not really for human society. It's because Jorgmander poses a threat to well maybe you could say he poses a threat to Asgard, but I think the point stands that it's for something beyond the self, beyond one's own glory.
Yes. Yeah, it's a sense of the common good, I think, and which is an emergent value. You could say that's emergent Christian value. The common good didn't really exist in the ancient world. I mean, you had eudaimonia, but it's not really the same as common good.
Well, I mean, res publica.
And I'll just back up your case though with what you were saying, Nathan, with just two other examples. Is that St. George also asked them, they're pagans. And so he says, oh, well, if you convert as well and you pray, this will help what's going on here before he slays the dragon. So that's planting a garden, isn't it? I'm not saying other people don't do this, by the way. Of course, the Dutch and various people go out and convert people to Christianity. But and the other example is King Arthur. When the Imperium turns up asking for taxes, and when he goes on his when they come to him, right, and he's forced to go over there. He was just trying to grill on his barbecue. Don't tread on me. And goes, well, you want your taxes, do you? No. And then goes over and conquers everyone. He turns up at one keep and sees who it and lays siege to it because they don't come and speak to him. And they eventually come out and they do battle. Gawain does battle with the person in the keep, and they realize the people inside are of the right. They have the common good already, and they just leave. It shows they're not there to just conquer and destroy. They're there to see if, right, to make sure the garden is correct. And so when their garden, this is a correct garden, we'll go back. The expedition's not needed in this particular place anyway.
Well, contrast the English. Oh, go ahead.
Well, just very quickly, Robin Hood is another example of somebody who serves the common good, because his initial conflict is Prince John takes his keep, takes his lands, calls him an outlaw. Now, naturally he leads some kind of resistance, but he doesn't just do it on behalf of himself. He does it for those who are also innocent, who have been dispossessed, but are weaker than himself. He provides for them. He gives them a place of safety, gives them wealth. He tries to restore their fortunes too. So he's fighting for not just his own kind of right, but for the common good, for justice, for the king's justice. Matt, you go ahead.
Well, just contrast the English knight and the temperament of the English knight when he goes off, or when he goes to the New World, versus the Spaniard, the conquistador, when he goes out. And you see the Englishman is much more balanced in his temperaments of exploration and conquest, and also tied in with this cultivation and this temperance, to be able to do it in such a way that you're ambitious enough and you're aggressive enough to get it done, but also take your time in the cultivation of family and community, in a way that with the Spanish conquistador, it's much more high in this very aggressive ambition, but lacks the same temperance and ability to cultivate that we saw, at least in the New World, when the conquistadors go out and they're full of fire and they're full of this lust for life, but lacking in the temperance in the way that's particular to the English. And then you get in the cases of, some other Europeans who are maybe so much higher in the sort of temperance that they lack the same level of Faustian drive to go out into the unknown.
Yeah, that seems to gel with the Hofstede cultural index as well, because I think the Spanish are higher in masculinity than the English, even though the English are high in masculinity, but they're lower in long-term thinking, I think, from memory, which would mean that, that they're not thinking about, what's this place going to be in 50 years? Let's do this. Perhaps. I just think, remember comparing them, that does seem to gel. So just backing up what you said. And it's not saying that they don't do any long-term planning. It's not saying, it's just this trait balance, isn't it? It's not saying that, it's just the English that go out and do the common good. It's saying, there's a balance of traits here that suit this particular thing. For people watching saying, but we do this in Denmark, or we do that. Well, yeah, okay, but it's this, isn't it? It's okay, that has a certain feature.
Why do these stories appeal here and grow here and become popular here and not in other places? I guess it's Matt, go ahead.
I was just going to agree that, it's this kind of balance of temperaments that gives the flavor to each of these nations and peoples in this way that's, brings out so much, so the true diversity, you could say, of Europe, and the true charm of it is seeing this different balance of temperaments and aesthetics and cultural traits that really resonate. So that's part of the fun of it.
Diversity is our strength, but I think there's one caveat I would want to add to this, because I agree that this comes from this culture, or Northwestern culture, during a particular time frame. We're really talking the medieval period here, that this arises, the merging of European cultures and Christianity in a distinctive way. But I think there's a particular tradition which manifests that, because it's not just that other countries have these sorts of traits, but in a different balance. It's also within England itself, there'll be some who have it more than others. There's some who did not display this, and indeed, the period just before Rupert, we were talking about this last week, the anarchy before Henry II establishes or restores order to the country. We see barons robbing each other blind, and the ordinary folk being terrorized by bandits and so on. So I think there's a tradition of chivalry, which is quite important here. That's the ideal that we're essentially describing, which takes root in this nation. And if I may, there's a very short essay by C.S. Lewis on chivalry, which I wanted to just read a couple of paragraphs from, because I think it articulates much of what we've been saying, and how this St. George is essentially an exemplification of this ideal, and you can see why he appeals so strongly.
Well, just before you do, quickly,
go ahead, Rupert. Yeah,
there is a sense in which, and thinking back to the that stream that we did, talking about the anarchy in Henry II, did come to mind when we were talking about Richard I and how he'd been inculcated in all of these kinds of romances and myths and everything. And yes, it's exactly the same kind of period. We were making this exact point about the kind of people who were being brought up sort of in Henry II's kind of world, with Richard I obviously being one of the sons of Henry II. And I think there's something to this idea of the renewal that happens every now and then, perhaps in some kind of like generational sort of situation, where all of the romances and all the chivalrous tales and everything are sort of like rediscovered or sometimes reinvented for a new generation, and then it gives rise to this new generation of people who respect these old tales.
And they reverence them so much because they've lived through what it's like when men do not follow those ideals and exploit one another and so on.
Exactly, because you have almost a mirroring of this phenomenon happening for one with the anarchy, and obviously towards the end of the anarchy, you have the rediscovery of all these kinds of tales, and then you get a new generation who are raised on them, and then the same kind of thing happens at the end of the War of the Roses as well, where you have a rediscovery of the romances and the Arthurian legends and whatever with I think it was Thomas Mallory, and there's like again a rediscovery and a new appreciation of all of these tales with Henry VII coming along and kind of like styling himself very explicitly in these kinds of terms, and naming his firstborn son Arthur and using all this kind of an iconography to kind of like nest himself and sort of like the realm around him in this, like very deliberately in this tradition.
And we must remember too that these aren't cynics. When they're looking into being, and they believe this stuff, and so I believe it, right? The fact that we don't believe it is the problem, right? So when they're looking into the tales, they're seeing that this is a part of being, right? You have to get into their mindset. I think the modern mindset's incorrect, like many of us are realizing, right? Is that these are forces that are in English being, you call it. I want to talk about the unconscious. I know I keep saying that. These things, Arthur, these things are there. So when they're looking at it, and especially for them, as we know from C.S. Lewis, when he talks about the medieval mind, the way they see the world, the Elizabethans, the way they see the world, they believe in elves. They believe in all these things, right? So we know C.S. Lewis describes this as well. And their mindset, high magic, low magic, they deeply believe this stuff. So they're not saying, I'm just going to, like these communists or these Marxists, when they go and say, why Edward III founded the Order of the Garter, and it's a political reason, it's about power. And they believe it. When they look in, they're in this, like you said, there's a time of degeneracy, and they think to this thing that formerly was, or that's in being. They think, well, we must find this thing. Where is it? Right? It still exists. They believe it. And then they start naming their sons Arthur and doing this thing and forming. What an amazing thing for Edward III to found this order of the Garter, say this knightly, we're going to renew Camelot, which is in a sense what we're all trying to do now, right? Is to re-imbue what is true, the truth of being. And a mighty thing for a king to do. You don't see that again. Well, you see a bit with Henry VIII. He does do so. I think he does, and like you said, to his father, sets. At least his brother was set up to be Arthur, right? So it's not just Edward. It's these. It does happen again and again, like Rupert says. This reconnection to the truth of being. I think really it's what's in their unconscious, if you want to call it. It's something behind manifestation that comes again and says, "No, imbue me, see me, come again," right? And the content fills into it, and they find the thing that represents it, and that becomes their hyper agent. And there's in a sense where Harry, England, and St. George, they're all the same thing. They're talking about the same thing. England, the king, is just the mortal that wears St. George, right? St. George is essentially an extension of the king when he's on expedition, when the king goes out, because he's not always St. George, because St. George is sort of an expeditionary appendage, right? You can't always be St. George. That's Gawain. Gawain is an extension of Arthur. He's the realm incarnate to go out on the quest and attack. But when you go back to the realm, you're not St. George, because St. George is for a particular thing. So if you see England as a pantheon of the greatest heroes, that's one appendage of the overking, as I talk about, that gets sent out to do the thing. And we see this evidenced in the sacred symbols of England with the spurs of St. George. That's particularly for the military, right? The spurs of St. George mean it's what the king is supposed to do. What do you do with spurs? You're mounted on a horse. The horse is the body. The horse is the military. What does a king do with spurs? He spurs the body. He spurs the navy to go on expedition, which is the body of the military, right? So if you're the virtue engine of the principle, you're the principle, the principality of the principality. And that's the St. George is the expeditionary body. And so that's why they are the spurs of St. George as a sacred symbol that moves the military out on expedition. So you can see this organism, and St. George is one part of that organism.
Rupert?
What do you think of that?
yeah, it's just quite a lot to digest. I mean, I was going to come in with an even more recent example, which I think is also potentially quite illustrating. If you're thinking in these kinds of terms of cycles of sort of degeneracy and renewal after rediscovering all of this kind of like all the tales and all the romances and all the myths. The last time that this got really popular in the common sort of culture, as I understand it, is actually in the late Victorian period, which you can potentially kind of like link again into a lot of the chivalry of the late Victorian officer class, leading into sort of World War I and the aristocrats and how they sort of conducted themselves. Now, obviously, we tend to think of that that whole sort of like movement and ethic as dying quite quickly in the mud, but I mean, there is a very definite sense in which, among a lot of people, it still stays alive, but it is sort of like cut quite abruptly short for perhaps the vast majority of the population. But if you're thinking these kinds of terms, then yeah, I mean, this is something which once again sinks into the culture, and the higher virtues of the Englishman and the English aristocrat especially can flourish again.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Like, what are the most popular books during that period? Oh, it's the Waverley novels by Walter Scott, who champions chivalry and writes books like Ivanhoe. The rediscovery of Arthur during that period. Alfred Lord Tennyson writes a cycle of poems about Arthur, which then go on to inspire the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood and men like William Morris, who put it into painting and tapestry and stained glass and poetry and so on. So there definitely is that within the Victorian era. I definitely see that, Rupert. I think that's a very astute point as to the age itself, which was there was a strong emphasis on kind of moral and social reform tied to, you know, we were talking about this exploratory dynamic, this desire to go and build the British Empire essentially, but this project wasn't just one for conquest. Actually, a lot of it, especially in Africa, was motivated by the desire to eradicate slavery. And so we need to go and conquer these places to make them better societies that they won't need to to have slavery anymore. So it's this kind of garden dynamic once again coming through of we want to improve these places, we want to renew them and make them better, which was at the heart of that project in many ways. I don't think it's an accident that all these things are happening at the same time.
You could even see it as an organism's immune response. If I'm just going to keep taking it back to the non-individual level, is that okay? So you have a cycle like Rupert talked about, and so the organism isn't needed. So you could even consider it as an internal expedition of St. George in a way. Thinking about it as if, okay, you need a territory that needs to be reconquered within the kingdom of England in the mind, virtual mind, you could say, right? So this organism, it's an immune response. The conservative revolutions we've seen were immune responses of other organisms, you could see as well. So it's not needed. Then it is needed. The poets see it first, that it's needed. Tennyson, as you mentioned, Nathan. So that's the organism, right? Overking, I want to call it a hyper agent, sends its particular way of being. And Rupert mentioned aristocratic. That's very true too, because recently some person that watches my channel said, oh, we're going to see, is it the yeoman's time to rise and take over the lordship? That's very egalitarian. That's not English. The yeoman is a particular archetype of an organism that's needed at a time of degeneracy, like we're talking about, that rises, but for the sake of the hierarchy. It's not rabid individualism or egalitarianism. So he's a 20%. You could even consider him a warrior class. And he's reading these stories like we are, like Tennyson and such. He's inspired by this chivalry and does the renewal that the aristocrats can't do. But then they bring him in and reforms it. And so there's a sort of a needed, there are a certain percentage of the aristocrats and the knights that are still not corrupted, but a large of them are. Like Chesterton talks about that too. You can have a Whig. There was a big Whig element that were completely corrupted and they're obsessed with fashion, right? So not all aristocrats are great, but there's always a portion that are conservative, and they're the people that Robin Hood works with. They're the people that, and you see that with Sir, I can't remember who he is, Sir someone. But it's for the sake of the hierarchy. It's an immune response, I think, as Rupert talked about. It's a thing that moves in waves. And the problem is this progressive revolution and technology seems to have disabled it to some degree. So I hope that it can rise again. But go, sorry.
Yeah, sorry. I was going to say, I think there is also a more deliberate component. I mean, if we're going to draw it all the way back to Will, and especially at the organism side, or, you know, in the superorganism kind of framing, there's been a sort of like a deliberate attack. So, you know, if you're getting into the nitty gritty of politics and everything, then ever since 45, there's been a quite deliberate attack to destroy especially the generational wealth of the aristocrats. And so the sense in which they can actually sustain themselves materially is sort of gone, and they are forced to return down to the same kind of levels or the same kind of ethics as all of the yeomen again in this frame of just kind of like joining in the rat race, because that's the only way for them to keep their head above water, especially when they're kind of sitting on their inheritance and their duties that they've been bequeathed.
Well, within the instinct of please go ahead.
No. I've talked enough. Go.
Well, within the instinct of the Englishman, within the middle-class Englishman, within the yeoman, there is this, I think we see the manifestation of this individualism and this desire for a more primal way of life where you're less constrained by the incredible managerialism that we have today. This gets expressed as libertarianism, but the reason it gets expressed as this sort of hyper-individualistic libertarianism is because the modern man is so removed from these healthy hierarchies that I don't think we realize just how much freer we are with a proper hierarchy.
Yes.
Versus that, it's like, we'll just get rid of all of it because we just want to go back to having our land, having our farm, raising our cattle, and being mostly left alone. But really, that in the more older English tradition, that does happen under the hierarchy, and you're actually freer within that than you would be on your own.
Well, there's, Carlyle sort of recognized this as well in sort of his various criticisms of the complete sort of abandonment of standards, especially for the sort of lower classes. The older comparison that comes to mind is that between something like the peasant or the serf or the villain versus the vagabond, because the vagabond is much more ultimately free, but the villain is able to exert a lot more actual, useful freedom, in that they are able to actually enjoy and properly live their life, rather than just sort of like scrounging from one day to the next and causing much trouble in doing so.
Yeah, the vagabond is oppressed by his freedom. And this is the problem. This is the dynamic, right? And this is the inherent flaw of the Jeffersonian yeoman. He misunderstood it. He saw the yeoman in Virginia and attributed that to be, he wanted that to be the entire republic, all these yeomen. No, the true yeoman isn't a hierarchy. It's a potential to rise, and a few yeomen are selected. It's a hierarchy, right? As Carlyle talked about. And they ascend the hierarchy to be a part of it. And so the Virginians understood that, but unfortunately they had to do with the slavery stuff and all that. So it's been completely ignored. And then the Puritan yeoman gets this idea, this fake yeoman gets taken to be, or we'll all be either this libertarian yeoman that has no hierarchy, it's just we're all the same, fake egalitarian yeoman. It's just not correct. Yeoman is more like a warrior class that went over with the Black Prince, that went over with, as every able-bodied man in England had a longbow, right? So it's a potential for this warrior freebornness, right? And everyone went over in the wars, in the 100 Years' War, and you've got every able-bodied, this never happened anywhere else. And this is going off subject a little with Robin Hood, but every able-bodied man training with the longbow, this happened nowhere else. And doing the wars, and then they came back, right? And they had these skills that no other nation had. And not everyone took up that potential. But then Jefferson takes it too far. They take it too far to be this egalitarian, full libertarianness. No, it's hierarchical, right? Without that, you lose your meaning, as Rupert said. Without that thing to ascend that's been sanctified by the king and as a pope, essentially, that's meaning, that's story. You fight as a hero to earn through merit. And this is the most meritorious aristocracy in the world, the English one, and a very small one, right? You fight to earn these things. And like we saw, Edward, they united people, they united yeomen, and they fought to have arms. Shakespeare purchased arms, right? That brings you into England's story. It's enchanting you. So yeah, it's just important to understand it's not egalitarian. Some yeomen will rise. That's to be a replacement elite, we could say, right? At the vanguard. Not all yeomen, but they're populists, though. But yeah, throwing it back to you guys.
Well, Nathan, do you want to, for those who are a little less familiar with the story, do you want to give people a bit of an overview of kind of what happens, what the key events are?
Before we get to that point, because I think I've just been enjoying this conversation, to be honest, Matt. But we'll get to that in due course. But I wanted to just raise one aspect, which is that, or two things. One is that this idea of the yeoman, I think it has its roots in Alfred the Great's military reforms, actually, in terms of the development of the feards. So this standing militia, where every freeman had to provide his own arms and serve within the feard. In contrast to other Saxon kingdoms, which didn't have essentially a standing militia or military that could be called up at any point. And this actually helped Alfred to, defeat the Vikings in various ways at various points. And that tradition then gets carried forward, that the freemen bear arms to protect their kingdom, essentially, during that period. Rupert, come on in at that point.
Yeah, well, I mean, that kind of like sort of bolsters one of the overarching points here, which is if you're looking at St. George as a kind of avatar for all of England, then it's perhaps not surprising that what you see on the ground, sort of like materially in terms of England, the makeup of England, is something which is vastly more inherently militarized and militarized across the entire spectrum compared to almost anywhere else.
Yes, 100%, because that we don't have a professional army. Because the Black Plague is more evidence for this. The Black Plague happened. That's why the king ordered every able-bodied man in England to train with a longbow. The French went to do it. They realized, oh, crap, they're too powerful. We don't want too many citizens having the longbow, right? And so they had professional armies on the continent. But every man, and like you said, the Burger defense system of Alfred the Great, I forgot about that. The Burg defense system was a decentralized defense system. Again, it's not egalitarian, though. It's part of a hierarchy. We just need to beat this in. We don't want to get to this French egalitarianness. It's just not how it works. So it's part of a hierarchy, that Berg defense system, and there's so much empirical evidence for it, right? So you've got like 3 pieces there that I think prove that, especially because you just don't see those things on the continent. Also, there's Enoch Powell talks about this as well, the rule of the country. The power on the continent was with the city corporations as it rises out of the medieval period on the continent. In England, the burgesses have the power. That's where the commons comes out of, and such, right? So the country, rural lords have a lot more power, right? In the way it was, the way it emerges. But yeah, the French city-states. You can even see this in where the king building Versailles. It's not very country, whereas the Englishman goes out to the country for his leisure. That's not a French thing. It's not a very German thing to do, as it is in England. You don't see it in their novels. In their novels, they're all centered in Paris. In our novels, in the Victorian period and such, it's always the country. It's always going out to fox hunting and men talking about going out hunting. It's very different.
I totally agree, and I think there was just one other point I wanted to kind of circle back to, that you had all been mentioning this contrast between the hierarchy and the bureaucracy or managerialism that we live in today. And I think that we see this if we want to talk about like being and why do certain stories appeal to us. Well, recently I wrote an article on Praxarchy, published on Praxarchy, about why do post-apocalyptic stories appeal to us today? What is it about like the zombie movie that strikes a chord with modern Western audiences? And I think it's the fact that it's in a world that we exist in, so it's not going back to the medieval era or something like that, where all of that managerialism disappears, and you then have various heroic men having to found or civilize, the wilderness, which is made up of monstrous beings like zombies, other gangs who are trying to tyrannize and exploit and will kill you. These few heroic figures have to kind of settle the land, conquer the land, make it safe, make a clear division between good and evil. And you develop a hierarchy as a consequence, but it's not based on procedure or on kind of various kind of stale forms of patronage. It's based upon this person has the qualities that I admire, and I can serve in the system that he has kind of ordered, that he decides what is right and wrong, and I follow and obey in accordance. And together, therefore, we build our garden amidst this horrible, chaotic, post-apocalyptic waste. I think that's part of the reason why it appeals to so many people today. It kind of mirrors what we're reading about, but in a context that we can kind of we can imagine ourselves in that context in a way we might not be able to in the medieval.
Yeah, I think that's a great scenario to show the emergence of principalities that have a prince at the top of them, right? Whereas what we're controlled by is a petrified dead being, which is the techne. It's a system that is made of old being, which hasn't touched the truth in a long time. So we're tyrannized by it. But yeah, Rupert, you're about to jump in there, it looks like.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say though, it is almost a reversion to that kind of like a personal rule that you would associate with feudalism. If you actually get into the detail of what feudalism was, then you get into a very lengthy academic discussion of what constitutes where. But in terms of like what you imagine feudalism to be, it's there is definitely a sense in which that did exist, where things were happening on much more of a personal level, and things were less procedurally prescribed according to like bureaucratic regulations and laws to be interpreted by various courts. Although there was still a little bit of that, we can't get away from it. But there is that like much more personal relation, and you can always just appeal to someone much more directly, going all the way up to the king if you can and if you feel like you need to.
Just on that note, go ahead, Scott. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that there's a big difference between having a lord or a hero that has the imperium within, as Vola talks about with the Frankish lords, and as I talk about with the yeoman inheriting a bit of that, having the imperium within, freeborn Englishman. That's what that is. It's you can lose that, of course, as you become more managerial, and that's what will happen to us eventually. But yeah, there's a big difference between that and being centralized bureaucratic rule. That's corrupted. That's a tyrannical system that will eventually, which is already stale and will eventually fall, because no one has the soul, that soul of the Imperium that you need, that you should have, that makes you self-deterministic, yet being in repose of the ancestors, as Heidegger might put it. But yeah, go on.
Well, just on this note, we've had a very apt super chat from Lady of Shalott, good friend of the show. Hello, Lady of Shalott, for $5 Australian dollars. There must be hierarchy. Nature is hierarchy. Any group, animal or human, organically forms hierarchy. To go against hierarchy is to go against God. Couldn't agree more. And a happy St. George's Day to you, Lady of Shalott. Hope you are keeping well in the land of Australia. I think as well there would be another thing that I would want to add as well, is that the with the kind of post-apocalyptic story, we have a clear division between the place of safety and the place of danger, right? You build your settlement and you've got your walls, and within your walls, the ruler kind of governs, establishes order. Life can be somewhat re-established to what it was before. You know, you're getting your food, you've got your power, you've got protection. You might be able to start developing other higher forms of civilization or whatever. But outside is the world of chaos, wilderness. There's the barbarians and the zombies and whatnot. And we see this dynamic within the older literature too. So, you know, you go outside of Odin's realm, and what do you find? You have the Jotnar and the monsters who are threatening to break into Asgard, and eventually at Ragnarok, they will. In the case of St. George, we have this dragon from the ocean, from the sea, that place of danger, which is threatening the civilized place. And it's up to George to overcome that, subdue it, and thus reestablish order. Whereas in our kind of cultural system, there are conceptions of good and evil, but there isn't this same. I don't get the impression that the managerial elite really believe in a. I don't know how quite to put it, because they definitely believe in danger, right? They see certain groups as dangerous, right? The deplorables in America, let's say, or you know the but they think it can be. They don't see kind of the metaphysical danger. They don't see the world as divided into the wilderness and the place of safety. They think it's all under their governance, and they just have to root out certain bits within it. And I think that's a fundamentally mistaken view of civilization, and it's why fundamentally things are crumbling, because they're allowing those kind of dangerous, chaotic forces to flourish within the walls of the sanctuary. Rather than seeing it, okay, we need to keep the walls of the sanctuary strong and everything within it strong against what's out there.
Well, yes, 100%. You've really articulated even the theme of St. George. What they are, think about it symbolically, is they're the enemies of St. George. They want to put a wall around St. George, around masculinity and men, and they also they think they can wall the dragon. That's what they think they can do. They are essentially like a petrified Platonism, where they think the techne and the calculation and the quantitative can predetermine everything. But that dragon keeps rising underneath, and you see that, right? And what this story of St. George says in its theme is, if you don't send out your young men to slay the dragon and then return with the boon, then what happens is, because what happens with the king is, the dragon says, I will go if you sacrifice first food to me. And then that's not enough for it. That's not enough for the dragon. So then it says, I want your children. And they sacrifice their children to it. And then it says, no, I want the king's children. And so then they go, the daughter gets put on the line, right? That's too much for the king. But what's that saying is that if you don't send out the youth and the children to become heroes, if you don't allow the masculine and the hero to go slay it, that you sacrifice your future. You give to the dragon. And so when you give to the dragon, you're sacrificing your youth and future. That's what it is. That's the theme of it. So that's, if you try to wall the dragon, it's the same thing, right? If you try to wall it, you try to incorporate it, you can never be incorporated. It is eternal. The unknown's eternal. The only thing that can defeat it is the hero, is the young man that goes out to defeat it. And they hate that young man, hate it, especially the females. The females in the managerial types, right? The feminist types. I don't know if you've ever seen this before. If you've ever been a hierarchy under a woman, there's nothing worse, unless they're based. And it's very rare that they are. They hate it up. They hate men. If they're in a hierarchy, they'll help a young man. They go, oh yeah, I see. He's trying to improve himself and do this, right? That's why we can classify this as a very feminine, dark mother, this petrified Platonism, this petrified system, because it has those features. It's squash it. It's like, no, we don't like this upstart. Whereas a man will go, oh, it's an upstart. Yeah, I see. Yeah, just here you go. Give him a bit of an opportunity. But yeah, this feminine, dark feminine says, no, you in your place. No heroism. Do what you're told, right? You'll get your pesky wages. You get your little commie out. Here's your, what was it called? Universal income. And you can eat your slop, but no heroism. Yeah. What do you think of that? I think that relates into what, I haven't taken that too off topic, hopefully, but it seems to fit nicely with where we are and what the St. George narrative really articulates.
Well, and it is directly a sacrifice of youth in particular, which is interesting. Sacrificing, the future and that which is, the vital. And you see that really when you get a society that's in complete spiritual decay. It is this tendency of the old to sacrifice the young. I mean, you can kind of see in many ways how that plays out today. You also see that even just in popular media, like in the Hunger Games, they have their reaping ceremony where they select from the children of the districts and they feed people to this beast, but it's this sort of media. They're feeding them to the bread and circuses.
Yeah.
Well, what comes to mind to me is almost like a fear of the unknown as well. So when a cost is imposed, then it's almost easier to, within this kind of structure, to just accept, okay, well, that's the cost for keeping things going. Therefore, we'll just do whatever that is in front of us, rather than opening the Pandora's box of whatever a great hero might decide to do, given the opportunity and given the encouragement.
Yeah, I agree, and I think if you look at like great male and female archetypes, so I think of somebody like Galadriel, for example, because she is in a position of authority, but she elevates, as you say, Scott. It's the elevation, it's the support, and that can take different roles. She takes a very, you've got the dark mother role, but you've also got the light mother, and she's very much that. I guess Mary. The Virgin Mary is the archetype that we're discussing there, but the dragon is its alternative very strongly. The dragon is often identified as this brooding mother that must be slain to get to go beyond. And we all have that sense of the overbearing mother who doesn't allow the son to really grow out and be married to another woman. And I think it's quite interesting that. In the George narrative, although he doesn't marry the princess, she's displayed in bridal clothing to the dragon, right? So it's the subjugation of the dragon allows being, to win the bride, essentially. And not only that, but she is told by George to put her girdle, a kind of garment which is associated with sexuality, over the dragon. So it's been totally subordinated by that point, and allows for this kind of flourishing, which if you wanted to push it further, what does sexuality bring? It brings new life, and it brings the restoration of the community. So you could read it in that kind of way, I think, the story.
Oh yeah. I mean, that's the gold of the dragon. You defeat the dragon, it turns into boon. The dragon is potential. So it's also the greatest. That's why you send heroes out to do it. It's the potential to renew. You can't, because what does the hero come back with? He slays the dragon, he has to bring back something to renew what made it arise in the first place. Because what makes it arise is thinking that you've got the truth, is thinking that your state, which is the problem with, again, the Old Testament religion before Christ came, was this thinking that, oh, the state can solve it. We can get the perfect law, which is what that culture tends to try breed. It doesn't like the heroism. Heroism's more, again, it's a European thing. It's the Greek thing. It's and they think they can have the perfect system to defeat evil, and then they keep doing that, and then Yahweh keeps smashing their city, destroying it, because they keep thinking that they can invent the perfect system. And Christ comes to tell them, right? So the people that deny Christ, that's what's going to keep happening to you if you do. But yeah, so our way of being is different. It's the hero, and it's certainly, that theme's very true. And you can see that the girdle being put at what's putting something around the neck of something, mastering it. I've mastered the unknown. I've gone out on the waves, which is what, again, I know this is a side tangent, but that's what Rule Britannia actually means. Master the waves, master the unknown. Britannia rule the waves, right? Which is an English verse. It's not even British. That's a civic thing. But it's just Englishmen talking about themselves, that song. But anyway, point is, putting the girdle around the neck. That's what it is. You take the life back, the woman back to the culture. And think about what the princess is. The daughter of the king is the greatest reward in the realm. So it's the archetypal reward, right? The gold of the dragon holds the greatest reward. So it's telling both the hero, to the people that could emulate the hero, they should go out and do that. But yeah, it's all there symbolically. It's not, you're not on a tangent there by saying that's what it means. That's what it means, Nathan. When you were saying that, it's just so clear.
And as you were saying that the girdle is shaming the monster, it's not treating the evil which has been plaguing the realm. It's not treating it as, well, we're gonna be respectful to this creature. It's no, we're gonna parade it around for the creature that it is in its proper place as being the defeated enemy that has been ruining and trashing the kingdom. It's not we'll just sort of defeat it and we'll respect the beast for what it is. There's no respect shown towards it.
Yeah, it's just ours now. It's now our possession, which is true. You see this also in Beowulf, when he gets the thing that defeats the demon in Beowulf is a sword he finds down there. He doesn't. It's not something he brought with him. It's the sword, and it stops glowing, and the blade dissolves. But he takes back the hilt with him, so the blade's gone. This weapon he got from the unknown, right, which is this dragon that's been girdled, as you say. But it's no longer a dragon. So it says that you've got the thing you took back, you have the hilt, but it will only work to solve that problem. This is the Beowulf thing. Anyway, it'll only work to solve that problem because another dragon's going to rise. That's why it doesn't have a hilt, that doesn't have a blade, but he still takes it back. So that story tells you that, the dragon's always going to rise again. You haven't solved the problem. It's eternal. But I do think the George narrative is more... because it's very simple, isn't it? This George narrative. It's more archetypal. It's more primordial. It plays out very quickly. You could just tell it in 3 minutes. You could tell the whole story, and that's it. You think, there's not much to this, but the reason why you can unpack all this stuff out of it because it's so primordial and so deep. Yeah.
Well, and the dragon will arise again eventually, but the key thing that separates someone like St. George from a contemporary superhero, and Nathan and I have talked about this a bit before, is that St. George demands something of the people of the realm. He demands that they convert. He demands that they address the evil that's within their own hearts that has led to the cowardice and to the sacrifice of their own children. He demands that they address that by converting and baptizing in a way that with modern contemporary superhero genre, like with the heroes that you get today, Superman saves someone, but he puts no demands on the people of Metropolis. Batman goes and beats up the criminals, but he doesn't put any demand on Gotham for them to do anything lasting or to earn that victory alongside him. So St. George pulls everything up with him. And there will be more dragons that will come. That's in some ways, I think Beowulf is maybe the follow-up story. Beowulf is what happens when these are the inevitable outside enemies on the fringes of the world that are less a consequence of the lack of brave men in Heorot, but are more of a consequence of just being on the fringes of the world, and you're always going to have existential threats.
Yeah, I think too with the Marvel superheroes is that they come back and they just they band-aid the degenerate filth society and let it go on, right? Whereas Robin Hood is a radically conservative external order, right? He's fighting. Same with St. George in a way because he's Christian. That's his order, and he's coming in and saying, "You're degenerate filth. You need to convert." That's what's caused this problem. Robin Hood in the same way, he's got the soul of England within that these people have walked away from, but not everyone, because you've got the lords that which we could consider conservative aristocrats come to his aid, right? And the king just doesn't know what's under him has been corrupted. So when Robin Hood, he does a similar thing, is that he comes in and destroys and defeats the middle managers. The sheriff kills the sheriff, kills the corrupt fake priests, all this middle under the king, and reforms that. And that needs to happen, right? And it's not all yeomen, it's not all people, but heroic ones that rise up, that have popular support, are supposed to come in. And this bloody degenerates need to be reformed by these radical conservative, or not conservative, radically traditional moral forces that realize it, which is what we're doing, because English heritage and places like that are completely corrupted and degenerate, need to be reformed by things like what we're doing today. Because who else is going to do it? It's just us. It's just the people on the new right that are willing to actually properly articulate and stand up for it. But yeah, 100% agree with you there, Nordhuger, on that. Reforming. We don't ask anything about, oh, no, you can, whatever you can do in your own home is fine with me. We say that, oh, this is a very liberal way of saying, oh, this way of, you whatever degeneracy, pedophilia get up to, or whatever it is in your own home, oh, that's okay, as long as you don't bring it into. No, maybe it's not okay, and you need to stop sinning. Anyway.
Well, I think we can see the situation in this way with the story of St. George, in that the dragon, in a sense, we were talking about the English anarchy. So he's like a robber band who is exploiting, tyrannizing a town, and the king is essentially the bad ruler. The people and the king do not show the courage that is required to take on this threat. They appease it. They try to appease it, and the king himself is shown as indecisive because he allows the situation to arise that it's by lot that the person is chosen. It's not he's not proactive in dealing with the situation. Then when it comes to his own daughter, he tries to get out of it by trying to bribe everybody in the community. And this is a recurring theme. I think when we read the Golden Legend, he seems obsessed with giving people money. He tries to give St. George at the end of the story as much money as he wants. And the way that he thinks about his daughter, he's sad because he will not get to see her become married. It's not because she's going to the dragon. It's that he might lose the advantage of a beneficial marriage for him and for his rule. So there is this sense in which he's totally consumed by greed, and he's a cowardly individual, and that allows for the exploitation of the community by the dragon. Whereas St. George, he is the embodiment of chivalry. He's courageous, and his courage comes from his faith in Christ. I think it was mentioned earlier that before he charges in, he makes the cross of Christ. He says with his sword, he says to the princess, there's no reason to doubt because I will help you in the name of Christ. And then he subdues the dragon, demands change. And then finally at the end, when the king tries to reward him, he refuses it. And he says, actually you should be giving that to the poor. And you should be listening to the priests and following their instructions. So he sets the king on the right path. It's this liberality of and generosity of spirit, which is belongs to the knight, should also belong to the ruler as well. Rupert.
And
I was just going to say, it's not just you mentioned the greed of the king, but it's not just greed. I wouldn't say, because he's also willing to just sort of give away money in order to try and make the problem go away. I think there's probably something else going on here, in that it's a very distinct mindset that we probably recognize quite widely here, in that, especially in the modern day, in that it's what's it called online, spreadsheet brain, Excel brain, just trying to like reduce everything to some kind of like some financial or just like quantitative measure, and then you calculate everything on a spreadsheet, and you're for example, you see it in business all the time, where there's just an attempt always to just try and get rid of all risk possible, even if it means just throwing infinite money at the problem. I just don't want to deal with whatever this question mark is going to potentially do to me. So it's not just greed; it's a particular kind of like spirit that we see incredibly prevalent in the present day, but evidently is a fair bit older.
He understands every. It's Longhouse. And he understands every relationship as just transactional. There's nothing deeper than that binding people together. Even his own daughter, it's a transactional relationship of, can I trade her for a good political alliance? It's an instrumental view of human value with no sense of, actually, other people have an independence and integrity, and I should cultivate that and elevate that. It's how can I use and what can I get out of somebody else? So when he meets somebody like, say, George, who doesn't operate on that kind of worldview at all, who does things because they are noble and good, and it's not that he doesn't expect any reward. He actually refuses reward for those noble acts. This is just totally beyond the comprehension of this king. But the St. George's hope, I suppose, is that through his baptism, and by commanding him to do good deeds like giving the money to the poor, by listening to and supporting the priests in their administration of Christianity, that this king will be directed back to where he ought to be, and his mind hopefully expanded. I mean, we never know, right? We don't find out afterwards what happens to the town, but I guess the noble knight can direct the ruler in error back towards his proper course without displacing.
Because the system thinks that the dragon plays game theory in a way, right? Is that the dragon of the unknown is not, it can't be, it's combinatorially explosive. You cannot map it with your game theory. And eventually, and this is going on Rupert's points about quantitative, right? You can't, it's combinatorially explosive. And the only thing that works against it ultimately are our symbolic categories, right? Using our heuristics and the divine. Because these are things that we've worked out that map it in a way that has allowed humanity to fight this thing. If it sends out the individual, if that individual is, connected to the transcendent, that individual has gone on an initiation, right? That has a higher being than a quantitative thing that thinks it can apply a covering theory of mathematics to nature. And we must remember that that's all these things ever are, these quantitative systems. They're only ever covering systems. And we see this with quantum mechanics, right? Is that the unknown keeps manifesting and you can't defeat this dragon and it keeps rising. Yeah.
And whenever you see a painting of a dragon, this great dragon creature, and you see a man on a horse, you see the knight on the horse, and you think, okay, the dragon has giant claws, the dragon has scales that are hard to penetrate, the dragon possibly even breathes fire and is giant and can just steamroll. Like, whenever you look at the painting, the odds, if you were to just look at it on a chart and you were to be this sort of bean counter, you'd be like, all right, well, the odds are probably 100 to 1 that the dragon wins. And you have to think as well, in the mind of the knight. The knight, if he's somewhat intelligent, is probably thinking, actually, I probably will just get annihilated by this dragon, at least through my own strength. And so the mindset and the spirit of the knight has to be one of martyrdom. It has to be saying, I probably will get incinerated in this. I probably will get speared. But being willing to say, I'm willing to do that. I'm willing to do that to charge the dragon. It's a very different type of mind to put it, because the knight doesn't know if he's going to win.
Yeah, dude, you're right. I think that we need to see this and understand it for modern day on the new right. What's going on is that the calculative game theory mind is not going to overcome this thing. Because as Nord, you just said, is that the dragon, it's 100 to 1 that they're going to win. It's the zeal and conviction you get from hopefully a second religiousness. And this isn't me saying it cynically either. I mean, we need plan trusters and true believers. And I think ultimately these things are true. And you can, for people that are full on hyper rationalist, you can work your way into this way of thinking. You can, if you haven't, you're not a good thinker. If you can't convert yourself into at least an idealism and then go back if you want to, if you can't do that, convert yourself into that way of thinking, even Christianity, then you're I think you're a failed philosopher. You need to have at least had both, get your perspectival knowledge into both, right? I'm just saying for people that reject this idea, right? This idea that the non-calculated thinking, the non-logic thinking is actually needed to defeat this thing. And the symbolic and the heuristics and these way of beings that aren't left brain, that are right brain, these right brain ways are the things that defeat it.
Yeah, because the dragon never will get defeated unless you have someone who is willing to die. The dragon is always, there's always going to be someone saying, well, you know, the odds are maybe 60%, 70, 80% that I die. I'm not going to do it. You know, we need to calculate some other solution. You need the man who's willing to say, all right, win or lose, I'm going for this.
Yeah, I was going to say, there's you could perhaps even go a step further and say that it's not necessarily even about considering death and being willing to accept death. It is doing a duty that is in front of you without heed to the consequences.
Yeah, for its own sake, and that's where the Northern European comes in. For its own sake, because that's unique to us, where the will for its own sake, martial will, and the sake of defeat and apocalypse for its own sake, which means it's the highest good, right? For obviously, when Christianity comes along, it lowers in the hierarchy, but that's very high for us. What Rupert said, I'm going out for its own sake. I know I'm dead. I'm just going out for its own sake. That's just because we've got to think what is for the sake of. It's something of the way that your world is filled in. It fills in everything you're concerned with. So if your cosmology is like that, you just will naturally do that. Whereas it seems to us like why would we do that? It's a non-calculative way of thinking as well, because that's not what you would do in game theory. You're trying to survive. But yeah, it's just for its own sake is very different than doing it for the sake of something else. Is that what you mean, Rupert? You're saying it's just for its own sake. It's just this is just what we do. We are Northern European. We for its own sake, because this is a good to sacrifice myself in battle, not even for the savior of the village. It's simply just because of it on its own.
No, it's not even the sacrifice. It is the confronting and fighting of the dragon. It doesn't matter whether you die or win in the process. You do your duty to fight the dragon because it is your duty to do it.
It's not to wonder why.
Despite the city, in a way. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, it's not to wonder why. It's only to do and die.
That's right. That's the Faustian, ultimately Faustian thing. It's not yours to wonder why. It's for you to do or die. 100%. We're all on the same wavelength on this one. Because it's hard for people to get that, to understand. No, it's just for its own sake. It's not for the village. It's not doing it for the village. The Northern European thing is it's just something that seems to drive us. And I sort of think this is related to all sorts of other values, which I won't take this on a tangent talking about them. But yeah, even Protestant work ethic. I think that's related to this bleakness, this for its own sakeness of work. It doesn't feel right unless you're losing. So you are sort of working for your own apocalyptic destruction in a way, right? You work yourself to death. There's a way we sort of do that Northern Europeanness. But there's a
sense in which it can be taken too far, because we've, in a previous show, we've talked about Merry England as a counterbalance to this. But you can possibly go too far in either direction. But yes, there is definitely that sense in which you. All these different qualities are done for their own sake. And to take it back to the point that another point that we were making earlier, slightly more briefly, there's an anecdote about this. I can't remember which island it was, but there was an island in the Atlantic which was encountered by numerous different peoples, and they just sort of stopped off, had a look around, saw that it was a completely barren clump of rocks, basically in the middle of nowhere that had almost no significance at all. But then the Englishman arrived, and he decided to turn it into a garden.
Yeah.
Not for any explicit purpose, just
Yeah.
sort of because he could and because he saw it as the right thing to do. So he turned this completely desolate, barren wasteland again into something that was lush, and not even for any overt purpose.
I think there's something uniquely English in that, the garden thing, because it's related to the island and the borders being established. And I can make a case for this quite easily. Is that on the continent, the wolves were raiding Paris up till 1916, right? 60 people were killed in Paris, the wolves. We killed the wolves, every wolf in England in 1200, all killed. So the Greenwood, the garden, becomes a place not of danger, but of boon, of garden. That's why Robin Hood goes to the Greenwood. Whereas when you look to these continental legends, the forest is the ooh, that's where the witch is, right? It just changes on England after we destroy it. We make it this. It's a place where the yeoman can go outside of the social contract, sort of go to have a sense of the moral order, I suppose. But yeah, I think that really is a way of articulating what Rupert's talking about as a unique English thing that has a long development too. So yeah, killing every wolf is a big part of that. There's no European bears, no wolves. And there's propaganda posters to prove this. There's German World War I propaganda posters that show the wolf killing people, pulling them out of trenches and various things that happened. Wolves came and ate soldiers who were already shot and wounded on the battlefield, and they're screaming while these wolves are chewing them to death.
There was an incident on the Eastern Front in World War I where I think it was the Bulgarians and the Russians or something. I can't remember who it was. They basically had to have a truce to fight off the wolves, because the wolves were just killing so many soldiers in the trenches that it was enough of a threat to both sides that they had to sort of call it off for a few days or whatever it was in order to actually survive the night.
Yeah. Yeah, it's crazy. Sorry, jump in, someone.
Well, I think as well, we have to bear in mind as well that this land is the perfect kind of land for the gentle garden, right? You go to some places in the world, maybe like South America, and you get the most zany plants, and they're amazing tropical creatures, but they're not very appropriate for human beings. They end up supporting life which is aimed at killing everyone. Or if you go to other places in the world, they are not they do not have the same kind of mixture of rain and sunshine. The rather broadly the landscape is not mountainous enough for it to be a problem either. There's a kind of climate here which allows the growth of gentle plants, which can be tilled and stewarded, and then either for decoration or for use. And I think it's that bond with the land which then gets carried around the world. And I mean, you could call it a kind of terraforming of various places into that old England. But it's that relationship we have with the land, which I guess I'm saying the land makes it possible to have that kind of attitude as well, beyond just our spirits are reacting to that and formed by that.
It has a reciprocal uprising. It's in the country, as we know, it becomes sanctified for one thing, but it's not just a place that's the walled city still, as you say. Yeah. It's also a place where sport is done. So it's actually a place of training. The cavalry is trained. Fox hunting happens. That began as a cavalry training before the Napoleonic Wars, or during the Napoleonic Wars. That's why part of the red costume is connected to that. So it's a place where you train before you go to the wild or before you go on expedition. But it's also, like we say, it's sanctified too. These practices of fox hunting become a part of a deep tradition that reflects even, they are supposed to, as we see in the Green Knight, it's supposed to be like a church service. The first recorded fox hunt in the Green Knight shows they hold a sermon before they go on the fox hunt. And they go through this procedure, and at the end of it, they have a thing. They lift the sword, which is a symbol of the civilization and defeating the wild creature. So it's a practice that you keep doing so the dragon doesn't rise. So you go and practice cavalry practice. You slay the fox, which is you slay the fox so the wolves don't come back, is how I put it when I talk about fox hunting. Because to do something like that, to break down your inauthentic being, which is what builds up in our ideas of things. We think we know everything. That's inauthentic being, where we think, oh, that's just calculation. It's just, this is a atom particle, and that's just a tree. You know, that stale knownness of a location you get when you're in a place you've been for many years. You can break down that with practices like fox hunting and get to authentic being behind it. So that's a practice that brings you towards the wild, I suppose you could say. But it's half-half. It's a garden. It's very different. It's reciprocally uprising, like Nathan talked about. And it is something that spreads everywhere. And really, if we weren't so soft, when all these people like, or I don't want to make this too political, but all these people like Native Americans or whatever, these places saying, oh, native rights or all that, we would just say, no, we conquered this, and now it's a Garden of England, F you, nothing for you. You know what I mean? You can be a citizen, but no, none of this wokeness. You don't get to any extra thing on top of that. We just say that this is now an extension of England, because that's kind of what happened. The garden was planted in these places, and they would have had nothing if that garden wasn't planted there, right? Because were they not successful? Could you not say it? They were reasonably successful in extending England to these places that they did a good job in. What do you think about that?
Well, and to go to that point, when you take a place like New England, let's say, it is still very much, you get this extension of England, but it's in a very different climate. It is a much less moderated climate. Pretty much everywhere in the sort of Yankee strip of America, the summers get blazing hot and the winters get much colder than you get in most of Scandinavia, like much colder for long stretches of time. Yeah. And it's because you don't have the moderation of the Atlantic. I mean, the Atlantic is still there, but the currents don't flow in such a way that you get this moderating weather influence. So you still see, I mean, even today in a lot of North American fiction and imagination and sort of like cryptid reports of the forest and the woods are still very much this place of where the wolves and the unknown and the uncharted and the creatures which sort of lie between scientific reality and the paranormal, that's where it all lies, is in the woods. And there's still the love of nature here, but it's still, even to a large extent, in the places where it hasn't been paved over with a Walmart parking lot, in those places which are still wild and have been unkempt for thousands of years, those woods are still very much a place of unease and a place of that which has yet to be cultivated. Because it's in America, it's a harsh dichotomy between, okay, here's a patch of land that has never been developed once in the history of humankind. Like you find a patch of woods in America that has never once had, I mean, there were natives and tribesmen who would go through it, but by and large, that land has never once been cultivated. So where you find these patches of land, it's still this hyper wild territory right next to hyper modernity, where you have the parking garage and the concrete, and you have the McDonald's.
Yeah, it makes sense. I think it's definitely un-English. I'd say that it's definitely in our primordial memory about how to do it. But the Europeans, like we do say, it's pretty wild in Scandinavia. It's pretty harsh place. It certainly would have been quite late. And like we said, there were wolves and stuff. So they were well equipped to. Yeah,
like this would be on my father's side in Sweden, going back about 150 years, or not even, it would be about like 120 years. There's still some stories in my family of how they would go to church in the winter, and they would be on their sleigh, or on their they would have they would be on their sleigh, and they'd be going to church, and they would have wolves like chasing them, running through the forest. They're just trying to get to church, and they'd have to like try to fight them off, or if they got too close.
Wow.
I do think, though, that there's kind of two things I wanted to say. And one of them is that if you look at like the great national parks in America, there's a fellow called John Muir who came from Scotland, but quite close to the border with England, and he was very important in basically protecting a lot of these places from industrialization. preserving, like, so the Yosemite National Park, that's like
Yosemite. Yeah.
That's yeah, that one too.
Yosemite. Sorry, who cares? We know what you mean. Yeah. Go on.
But like these places too, they're wild places, but they're conserved, right? So it's still part of a garden in a sense, because if there wasn't like the wall, and there wasn't like various environmentalists who were kind of watching the ecosystem and trying to push the ecosystem in certain ways to make it still flourish within the current world, it would be gone. So even a lot of these wild places require that kind of conservationism, which comes from that spirit.
Yeah.
I think. So sorry, go ahead, Scott, because we'll come to my other point later.
Oh, sorry, man. I didn't mean to interrupt you. That's
No, it's okay.
Quickly tried to throw it back to you. But yeah, I was just going to say that the frontier spirit, it comes from the English borderlands as well. Is that these people were? It's not something new in America. It's the folk ways of America come from Britain, right? So this idea that it was the frontier that formed them, that's a late thesis. The borderlanders, who were, as we know, that's where Nathan is from. Up in the borderlands with mutual descent right up there in Durham. These people were savages, right? But they were sort of had a procedural thing that was very old at the same time, right? They're very more Viking-like. They're very more, they have an old way of being, yet it's a savage way of being. They were well prepared for the borderlands. And these are the Appalachians. These are the people that sent to the frontier. They particularly even say, we'll send those people. The Quakers said, we'll send these guys to here and put them between us and the Indians, right? So there was a distinct thing. They knew that these people were well suited to it. And so it's not something that's unknown in Britain, that way of being. It's pretty fresh, at least from the wars, to fight Indians, even if there weren't wolves and such. The soft Southerners might not have known it as well. They certainly understood hierarchy. I'm a big fan of they're my two favorites, the Appalachians and the Virginians, which that went there. But yeah, I think that you probably had emergent features too. I don't want to discount new American things adding to it, but certainly that power of that warrior spirit was with them when they went, the Appalachians and
Well, and I didn't mean to imply earlier that the hypermodernity, the Walmarts, the parking lots, all that. I didn't mean to imply that is an extension of English character or the that's more of kind of its own separate thing. But yeah, it is kind of the English, because the further east you are in America, that is the more settled, the more tended. You go to some of these old towns in New England or so, they're much better, they're much more garden-like. Whereas the farther west you go, that's where it's a bit more sprawling, it's a bit more chaotic.
Yeah, that makes sense. At least from my reading, that makes sense. I haven't spent any time out there, but I've been on the coastal cities. But yeah, from the accounts, it seems like a really beautiful place. That Kentucky, these middle regions, they took a long time to settle those places. So it was a brutal thing, but very wild. It still is, wild in many ways, but also there is a lot of modernity connected in. But that's where they still are. If you want to go to a place where you see the Anglo-Saxon, the Northern European, you'll see them in Utah and places like that. I'm not sure where you are right now. Probably where you
Minnesota.
are. I've seen you in snow, right? Oh, Minnesota, right? Yeah.
So
Snowy.
yeah, no, I would say, Midwest. Midwest. Everyone says Midwest and they mean a different region, but I find that the so-called flyover country of America is where you have, at least where I feel most at home. I love kind of the small town culture. There's just something very, very at ease about it all, and just the friendliness that you get with the small towns that you don't get elsewhere. Not as many, but again, once you get to kind of the region of the country I'm in, you get a much heavier German influence. You get a lot of Irish. You get Scandinavians up north where I am, but then you get a heavier amount of German that kind of outweighs the English. So you really have to go kind of further south, or you have to go further east or further west to get back to the more particular Englishness.
I was just thinking, it's quite curious that you mentioned Virginia as well earlier, because Virginia was another place that drew heavily from the borderlands, but it was the Welsh marches instead of more so than the Scottish marches, and some of the same culture I suspect still existed, but to my knowledge, the warfare was a little bit different, a little bit less gentlemanly.
Yeah, they probably sent a. So, no, you're no.
Well, I was going to say, so Cheshire in particular was absolutely despoiled to the extent that I think as late as the I want to say 14th century, possibly a little bit earlier than that, 13th century definitely. It was still basically pretty much just desolated and only being sustained by new colonists from other regions, basically.
Yeah, that Wessex essentially is where that Virginian and like you said, there was people sent from Wales as well. My guess would be they sent those Welshmen to the backcountry of Virginia, which is essentially where the frontier is. Whereas a lot of the hierarchy people, they're the hierarchy respecters. They're my favorite, the types of Americans.
Well, they also did. They also did deliberately, much more deliberately, take from the royalist aristocracy and the Welsh marches region. Sort of on both sides was on both sides of the border. The Mon border was very, very royalist.
Yeah, you see over time that area is always conservative. When these revolutions are happening, that Wessex area, the west of the country, says no, we're with the king, we're with the thing. It's always the more. Maybe that's to do with the continent. I don't know. It's the Essex area. The Anglia is more seems to go with the revolution, I suppose you could say. That's where the Puritans were, so that makes sense there as well. But yeah, these Cavaliers were very Chad, and it's almost a shame that they didn't win out. Forget the slavery thing. Let's just put that aside. That's just an unfortunate thing that was defeated by them anyway. Put that aside. But the hierarchy, the idea of having a appropriate yeoman, a hierarchy, and an appropriate aristocracy that someone can rise in, that would have been, perhaps today, would be in a much better position if it hadn't have been the egalitarian Puritan way of being that ended up taking over with their progressiveness. If it had have been the Southern way, where you have this hierarchy and you have this thing people are going to ascend that's more permanent, it has these things like mythos and various things, perhaps a king, because they were on the side of the king too, these Virginians. These elites they were fighting the revolution, and even people that signed the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, said this, is that we're doing this against the elite parliament, but for the sake of we want the king to rule us. That's what a lot of these people, the reason why they did it to begin with, rather than for a republic to begin with.
Yeah, trying to overthrow the Whig dominance, and the idea was floated that they would accept the Stuart Pretender.
Yeah. Right, I didn't know that. That suits my theory about it. Thank you.
Yeah. They invited the Stuart Pretender, but he wanted to shoot for the whole thing rather than just having a breakaway part of the whole Commonwealth that he was looking for.
Wow.
I did want to return to one point that you made, Scott, that you were talking about the Native Americans, and I think I don't want to go too much into it, but because it's a lot more complicated than it's often portrayed, like the simple Native Americans living in harmony with nature. Well, like the Navajo start in Alaska and come down to Arizona, and the Pueblo people, their oral history basically says, these guys like took our culture, took our land, and tried to make it their own. But I didn't. I at least respect the idea of the garden was made, but they reject it because they feel that's their land, and I kind of feel like we get that in the sense like our garden is being taken from us. So I can see that idea there. I understand it, even if I don't think it's if you look at the history, it's not quite right. But I think also you could see in the mythologies we were talking earlier of a primordial age before the garden gets built in all of these different places. Like Britain has that with the Brutus story as well. And whether or not there is this kind of idea that there are civilizations which do have this, they're more identified with nature and all of its wildness and live in that wildness. And then there are other kind of civilizations, like the English one that we're talking about, which tries to build the garden, and that these two will come into conflict. You know, no matter how hard you try to put the two together, they're kind of two ways of being, two modes of being that are fundamentally irreconcilable.
Yeah, perhaps that's possibly true. But I think if you're going to have some sort of grievance, victim culture, it doesn't matter who the native was. I mean, but the truth of the matter is that no, all you were genociding each other in your own tribal wars. An English tribe turned up and defeated you and planted England there. You lost. You can now be a part of New England, right? Or you can, I don't know, you can keep fighting the war. But because we're so soft in victim culture, and we offer them, you're offering a people citizenship in your own country. Most other places would have just wiped them out completely, right? So if we had been more chat about it, even in, say, Canada's the same thing, is that we go, oh, French, oh, we'll allow you to keep speaking your language. And look what's happened in Canada now with the separatism and all that. What really probably should have happened is you go, no, you're speaking English now. You're English, or you can go, right? You know, I'm not saying we do it now. I'm just saying that if you were more Chad, you'd say, yes, you're welcome to be a citizen of this country. We won. That's the narrative now. You're now this, you know, but so you have a situation where it's just perpetuated. So, but that's of course something that if you said this on GB News or anywhere, that you'd just be attacked by every leftist or whatever. So they'll never say it like that. But that's the truth of it, is that you lost. But we're going to lose because we have this self-flagellation now, this victim flagellation, where we'll allow it to go on where we're still the majority, right? So could you say they've got a claim as the native because they're there first? Not really if you lost, but we're allowing it. You only have a claim because we're allowing it, right? Because you lost the battle for the place. It hasn't been that long, given, but so you could say the battle's still going on. But with England, it's a lot longer for one thing. So there's a much greater claim we have, because as you articulated in one of your tweets, Nathan, is that Navajo came down in the year 1400 or something. Right?
That's right. Yeah.
Whereas we've been in England for thousands of years, years, you know, a long time. So that's a people, and it's a much longer period of time. Also, we're the majority. But if we don't make sure, we're going to be in their position if we don't do something about it. But yeah.
Well, go ahead, Matt. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say it's a situation that I don't have any good answers for, because I mean there's so many levels to look at it on, and on one hand the true level of brutality that was inflicted upon the settlers and the colonists who came to America is something that's very, very often just tucked away, not in the history books. I mean, there are stories of how colonists would be tortured in the most horrendous ways, that the civilians, you know, had their eyelids like cut open, and they'd just be like disemboweled, staring at the sun as they would slowly die. Like just horrendous stuff. But on the other hand, too, I think in the interest of just sort of preserving the variety of ways of life and more ancient ways of life, there is something that very much was lost with the sort of corralling of the natives into very narrow strips of land. I think there is something that does sadden me very deeply about that. And I understand from the perspective of a native, you know, they've been genociding each other and doing horrendous things to each other for thousands and thousands of years and migrating all around and haven't always been in the same stable locations. But on the other hand, you know, if you do see an Englishman who's this other tribe, there's still something categorically very different about the Englishman that is, in a sense, alien. So, you know, if I was native, which I'm not, but if I was, I can at least feel and see the way in which that would be that would be this profound feeling of displacement and of takeover. That being said, how many, as you were saying, how many other groups and tribes and nations of the world would even give a second thought to, the consideration of the concerns that natives have? I mean, how many would just be like, oh, you're upset about this? Oh, well, who cares? We're just going to wipe you all out down to the last man, woman, and child. That's the norm throughout all of human history until very, very recently.
Yeah,
it's a profound change to even consider that at all. That's a paradigmatic shift in how civilizations treat each other. That's pretty much wholly new on the world stage for a group like the English to even consider that. I mean, I would be hard pressed to think that would be reciprocal should it have been the natives coming to England. And it is this degree to which we can say, conquering is sort of its own set of rules, and it's its own set of how civilizations play themselves out. And also it is to say, okay, well, we see the spiritual state that Native Americans are in today. We see the state of what happens when you are displaced. And this is even in a situation where you get at least a certain level of conciliatory mercy, and you get a certain level of, all right, we're still going to let you have your own territory. Whereas what we see with a lot of Europe today is, I think we need to look very long and hard and say, all right, this is the spiritual state of Native Americans. This is the state of their being as nations today, and how hollowed out it's been. Think of how much worse that situation could be for us should we let it get to that point, because there won't be the Englishman who's trying to, make a deal or be reasonable. There is none of that on the other end.
Yes, that's so true, man. Do you think that the Islamists are going to have no? There's going to be none of that. It's going to be over. So people need to realize how bad it's going to get, and they're going to. I think the revolutionary spirit will start to rise when the working conditions and the economic conditions of resources start to dwindle. Then you're going to see people starting to recognize that. But also what you said there, Nord Huge, I'll just make this point quickly and let someone else jump in. But yeah, there is a point to be made too about the pluralist nature. I mean, I want Japan to be Japan. Now all the places have been discovered and such. I want to see Japan be Japan, even though modernism has taken over most anything anyway. I want to see what comes out of their culture. I don't want to conquer them, right? We've got our native lands. I just want the people out of the native lands that are trying to change it into something else. In America, I don't know what you do with America. We can't really talk about that, can you? There's nothing to be done, really. But yeah, pluralist, there is something to that. I do want to see them have a place and evolve somewhere. But still, are they evolving? Even with all the stuff that's going on with modernism, is it too late for that? These native cultures, are they doing anything in their one direction? Does this mass communication take that option away to some degree? I don't know.
I kind of go back and forth on that particular question, if only because sometimes you see like rumblings that are just barely below the surface. If you pay attention to especially a particular culture for long enough, and you kind of see how much there is lip service being paid to the monoculture, where underneath there's certain things bubbling and certain resentments, especially in Japan. Japan seems like a really good example of that, where all of these different people, especially in sort of like elite circles, have very particular, very unacceptable beliefs that are not allowed to be espoused particularly publicly, but it still has a sort of subtle effect on policy here and there. And you can almost see the writing on the wall that the moment the Eye of Sauron isn't on them anymore, then whole lot of things come back into play that haven't been seen for a long time.
Tell us more about that, please. Can you tell us more about it? That's just really interesting. Just things. To sort of be more explicit about it. Basically, there's like a whole lot of people in various business circles, especially, who have sympathies that are, basically Imperial Japan. They kind of want Imperial Japan back in a lot of ways. There's a lot of fondness for that period and a lot of attempts to rehabilitate
and like present alternate histories. I remember there's one very famous hotel chain where I don't know if they still do this, but they used to give a copy of this particular Japanese history in every room, and it was, you know, basically like full pro-Japanese revisionism to the utmost degree. And you kind of, and there's certain other things as well. Like, so I'm going back to the stream that I was having quite recently. The Black Dragon Society is one of like the big arch enemies. They were like the archetypal evil Japanese like secret society entity that America was like dead set on rooting out, and they used that as the example for like, and it was explicit in the wording of anything like this needs to be banned. Anything like the Black Dragon Society needs to be banned.
Wow. And
they got refounded in 2008.
Wow, we need this. We need the St. George Black Dragon version of it, right? This is a based nationalists, right?
Wow. But you even red and white dragon.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of wealth behind this, right? You're saying businessmen. So there's this. Okay, wow. I wish
the Yakuza. A lot of the Yakuza are on side with this as well.
Yeah, wow. That's interesting. The underworld. There's so much potential in that. I see this with England, that if we could get that with the football hooligan societies, like the underworld on side with our vanguard, right? Because that's kind of what you got. You got the thugs, the Yakuza, and the vanguard.
Really? Oh, we actually sort of have a vision of what that would look like.
Really?
So in like the alternate timeline, essentially, where the government doesn't have like an omni focus on trying to crack down on football hooliganism, is in a lot of ways it looks like the Ukrainian right, because the Ukrainian right kind of evolves out of, in large part out of especially I think it was the eastern Ukrainian football hooliganism scene, centered around like Kharkov FC and places like that.
Wow. I mean, it's worth looking at all these case studies, but also finding out ways to not get gladio nationalism, CIA stuff, right? Because Ukraine, I guess that got turned into gladio nationalism by the CIA because they're monitoring it, I suppose, in Ukraine.
Eventually, yeah.
So you want the base Japanese version that's keeping itself sustained, powerful, despite the Eye of Sauron, than the Ukraine one. Although there might be definite things you could take from the Ukraine one, based on that hooliganism, that sort of thing, right? Because you need those things melded together, as Bowden talks about. That sort of, and this is so off topic, but it's interesting. It's fascinating to me anyway. Hopefully, the people watching as well. But yeah, Bowden talks about that, is that we need to be both high culture, but have thug strength and be comfortable with violence, which just means you need to be trained, because men are warriors fundamentally and should be trained.
I think maybe to bring it back round to St. George somehow is that what we see with St. George is he brings together that thug strength with the compassion of the chivalric knight. And I probably about 3 hours ago, I said I was going to read a passage from C.S. Lewis, and I'm going to read it now.
Yes. And I probably sent us on this like long ass tangent. Yeah, sorry, go. Please.
No, please don't apologize. I'm going to read it because I think it taps into a lot of the different themes that we've been talking about. So he writes, the important thing about the ideal of chivalry is, of course, the double demand it makes on human nature. The knight is a man of blood and iron, a man familiar with the sight of smashed faces and ragged stumps of lopped-off limbs. He is also a demure, almost a maiden-like guest in hall, a gentle, modest, unobtrusive man. He is not a compromise or happy mean between ferocity and meekness. He is fierce to the nth degree, and meek to the nth. When Lancelot heard himself pronounced the best knight in the world, quote, he wept as he had been a child that had been beaten, end quote. What, you may ask, is the relevance of this ideal to the modern world? It is terribly relevant. It may or may not be practicable. The Middle Ages notoriously failed to obey it, but it is certainly practical. Practical as the fact that men in a desert must find water or die. Let us be quite clear that the ideal is a paradox. Most of us have grown up among the ruins of a chivalrous tradition. We're taught in our youth that a bully is always a coward. Our first week at school refuted this lie, along with its corollary that a truly brave man is always gentle. It is a pernicious lie because it misses the real novelty and originality of the medieval demand upon human nature. Worse still, it represents as a natural fact something which is really a human ideal, nowhere fully attained and nowhere attained at all without arduous discipline. It is refuted by history and experience. Homer's Achilles knows nothing of the demand that the brave should also be the modest and the merciful. He kills men as they cry for quarter, or takes them prisoner to kill them at leisure. The heroes of the sagas know nothing of it. They are stern to inflict as they are stubborn to endure. Attila had a custom of fiercely rolling his eyes as if he wished to enjoy the terror which he inspired. Even the Romans, when gallant enemies fell into their hands, led them through the streets for a show and cut their throats in cellars when the show was over. At school, we found the hero of the first 15 might well be a noisy, arrogant, overbearing bully. In the last war, we often found that the man who was invaluable in a show was a man for whom in peacetime we could not easily find room, except in Dartmoor prison. Such is heroism by nature, heroism outside the chivalrous tradition. The medieval ideal brought together two things which have no natural tendency to gravitate towards one another. It brought them together for that very reason. It taught humility and forbearance to the great warrior, because everyone knew by experience how much he usually needed that lesson. It demanded valor of the urbane and modest man, because everyone knew that he was as likely as not to be a milksop. Thoughts, gentlemen?
I can jump in. Okay, so what I think about this is you see it taken too far when it's the French version where it's sort of you could call it almost like Platonism, but slightly it can be petrified. Platonism as in strong Apollonianism, where you have everything that is known, which is like chivalry, right? You're enforcing your nature, I suppose you could call it, if we want to use the word nature necessarily. You're enforcing that with this, which becomes petrified. So they become over feminine, over reliant, and disconnected from reality. And so they're defeated by the yeomen in the 100 Years' War on all these knights on horseback, that sort of thing, right? But when it's done right, you could even bring Heidegger in here, where what you're looking to be is to be a being in repose of your ancestors, which means repose means, think about it, repose, but not as an exact copy. You need to be in re-solution, which means to look into your past entthronedness, which means to strip yourself of the narratives and actually get to the truth of the history and the being as best you can, because that gets you to authenticity, right? And then you sort of, when you do that, the authentic possibilities of the way the world looks to you appears all the possibilities open to you, right? And then you're sort of that Dionysian Nietzschean who is connected to the non-petrified reality, which is becoming, as Nietzsche talks about becoming, right? And so that's what he calls the grand style, which is the artist that's more connected to the becoming. It's not stratified with the Platonism. So he's in resolution to the truth. And so, but it's a mix of both being given form by being, which is the more semi-permanent things, or the permanent things, but also connected to becoming at the same time. That's the radical subject. That's not just a brute, but is more like this chivalrous figure, if done properly. That's the ascetic knight. So he's both a Dionysian, but he's not a pure brute great mother Sibelian, the goddess Sibelian. Yeah, he's both, right? But he's not stratified Apollonian either. Sorry, not petrified Apollonian, which is the French thing I'm talking about. Does that make sense? So you're trying to find that balance between them. Then you are this thing. Because if you just completely obey it all, those rules won't be permanent to every situation, like we see with St. George. The dragon always rises, right? The rules won't always apply. But if you have a balance between them, you are hopefully this ascetic knight, this ideal knight. Does that make sense?
Makes full sense to me. It's I think that's right, and because it's not just as you said, it's not just repeating, it's reposing. So it is that bringing into your current moment those same values in a way that is appropriate to that moment. So I mean, so like in some sense, we want to re-articulate that chivalrous tradition without the trappings of it. Because, well, maybe that's the wrong way to put it, but I think you get what I mean. Like, rather than taking the surface level appearance of it, actually the essence of it is what counts, and that's what gets should be re-articulated.
Yes.
Whereas the kind of trad cons, their thing is taking the aesthetic or the surface level, and then, I mean, there is a way of that can help if you are doing the behaviors that come with that to then build that up in you. But more often than not, like, they're still taking selfies and posting them on Instagram. So then it's the aesthetic they want, not the moral, metaphysical core, which underlay that aesthetic in the past.
And what should happen when you do it authentically, even if you start enacting the behaviors, what should happen? And I've had a sense of this before, just phenomenologically myself, when I've done practices that are similar like this, that are related to what Heidegger talks about. And you can do one which is called not open ground. It's, Walter, I can't remember his name. DM me and I'll tell you it. Anyway, so when I look it up later, but what you do, being in repose and resolution, finding the authentic truth of this thing, is what happens, because being itself has the ecstasis of having been in the past, and that's history, that's everything. So when you get to the authentic truth of finding out what the events really were, like, you know, the fake violin playing you have of your history, well, that person said this. You don't really say the events. So when you actually say, oh, what just happened? What was just what happened at that time, right? You're sort of clearing the inauthenticity. What happens when you do that is that that's resolution. You're resolutioning your being by doing that. And when you're being in repose of your ancestors, let's say, when you that's understanding the authentic history of who you are, but also it's part of your existential being. What happens is when you do that is ideas don't just come to you. It's more the authentic possibilities are thrown in front of you. So the world glistens. This is the glistening you get. This is the overman. This is Nietzsche's overman. When you can get a sense of this. I don't know if you guys have ever had a moment of vision where you've seen the authentic truth. The possibilities that are thrown in front of you when you've cleared some falsity before you, right? When you've had perhaps a dark moment or something. Most people have had at least one moment of vision where they said, I can't believe I didn't see this possibility. The world seems to, after the darkness to a light. What that is the authentic is thrown to you from your ancestors. Those possibilities, though, are historical. So it's not going to be the same for someone that's not Faustian, right? So the ancestors that you're being in repose are, it's possibilities. It's not just a blank copy. It's thrown to you from your unconscious, you could call it. And then those possibilities are limited to the historical being of what your ancestors did as well. And we always possess that. And we just get lost by the inauthenticity, that propaganda that's sent to us. But yeah, that's what we're talking about. So it's not just a copy. It's the very possibilities that are thrown to you when you're in authenticity and you are being the overman, I suppose you could call it. Yeah, are of your ancestors. It's not just some idea that came to you. It's from the ancestors and historical being. Hopefully that makes sense. I shouldn't use this Heideggerian terminology, but it should make sense.
Well, this is kind of what I was thinking about actually when the Enriab sent a super chat earlier for £5. Let me get on the stream. He was responding to Lady of Shalot's point about hierarchy earlier. To question hierarchies as absurd as to not know the difference between a man and a woman. However, these are the times we live in. And my thought at the time was, perception or apprehension of the world. When we read something like Lord of the Rings, one of the reasons why it's so refreshing is we're getting what C.S. Lewis would call visible souls. Things appear as their nature is, their being is. And so when we see like the ring wraiths, for example, they are between life and death. They're undead beings, and we the characters see that in their ghostly forms, but also the feeling that they exude of despair and terror. And so the whole world is like that, and it appeals to us because we want that kind of world where we have that clarity of seeing that. And I think somebody, the like Edward III, when he founds the Order of the Garter and he steeps it in the legends of Arthur and St. George, like he sees the world in that way, or he's able to.
Yes.
But we are so cut away from these stories. We do not have, we've been, and at the same time, we have been taught a whole way of viewing the world through education, through the media, through just the activities we're engaged in, which strips us away from that kind of metaphysical clarity, which thus makes it very hard for us to see things directly. Indeed, that's why we have such an age of cynicism, doubt, questioning, relativism, because we in a sense, it's not just an intellectual thing, it's our perception has been clouded. And so it is in those moments, those gestalt moments perhaps, where we do receive that. But in general, we find it in this world, in this modern age in the West, so hard to have that. And that's what really struck me about that. So I think that's why the stories appeal to us in part, because we get to encounter that in a way we don't normally.
Yes, they're authentic, right?
Yeah.
This isn't authentic. The gestalt of the enframing that we're in is false modernism, quantitative calculation. The authentic is what it's calling you to and pulling you towards. It's clearing. And so when you read those stories, we probably get a sort of minor moment of vision, don't you? Where the world looks different to you suddenly. That's the authentic thing. It's cleared that the inauthentic. It's cleared the sort of inframed, propagandized narrative that we've been given scientism at public school.
Well, that's incidentally why I did want to sort of push back a little bit on a point that you made slightly offhand earlier, Scott, about people sort of waking up a little bit more to, as times get harder and sort of being reinvigorated to sort of challenge some of the corruption that we see around us. I don't think that's necessarily true, because it depends more on the framing.
Yeah.
I think things can get much worse, and the reaction can be to demand more of what's making you sick.
Yeah, it can go
more of the corruption. More, the problem is that we're not doing modernity and all of its corruption hard enough. Whereas the difference that you get in some of the ages prior that we talked about is there was a recentering back on certain mythological truths that then allowed a recentering of virtues. And even if the times weren't necessarily that bad, as in the case of the Victorian era, obviously they had their own challenges, but we can probably say that it wasn't as bad as the height of the War of the Roses or the height of the Anarchy. But still, they had this recentering, and it still propelled them on to much greater things. And that is the key thing, I think, more than any material conditions, because the way that you view your material conditions and the way that you even measure what is materially good or bad is something which is not a self-evident frame.
No, I agree with that. I think all it presents is an opportunity. We're actually in a worse position than they were, because the technological enframing is so much more powerful than it was before. It also presents, though, it gives us power because we can go on the internet. It also seeps into authentic being. And that's what going to church is. That's what's having these rituals, that you're constantly trying to hold fast a gold, right, to clear up the inauthenticity. Every time you go to church, you get closer to the authentic truth, doing these practices, right? You go constantly, it's like breaking out of that world of the inframed modernism, and then you're trying to hold this fast. And then as you go back into the world, it's like taking a bubble, like a Galadriel's vial or something, into Mordor. Every time you leave church, that's what happens. Whereas before, back in Greek times, they're living with the gods. Heraclitus sees God in the hearth, right? He sees it. Oh, that's God. That's the gods there. It's just they symbolically see it properly as it's supposed to be. Being is enchanted. Being is not enchanted. This is the enchantment. Being is naturally how it's supposed to be, right? C.S. Lewis talks about this, is that Christianity seems less plausible in a modernist hotel room, but not at your proper chapel, right? But it's less plausible here, where it's a blank room, because that very location is imbued, as Rupert says, it's imbued with utilitarianism. So you're seeping into your being. Whereas if you made it a neo-Gothic hotel room, what's going to happen? It's properly aligned with the Faustian man's old structures, right? So everything is this. My room I'm in is seeping into, like, it's not. This is not a chapel. It's modernist. It's utilitarian, and so we're constantly walking into Mordor every time we leave church, right?
I mean, I think that's something profound that you're putting into words that I've just tried to figure out how to express, which is that, if you look at a painting or an image of something that's inspiring and heroic, the setting that's in, the environment, the architecture, whatever that is, that lends itself as much to the formation of the hero in the image as, the man himself. So you put a man, let's say he's wearing whatever his outfit is. You put that man in this grand Gothic cathedral. Suddenly, everything that he's doing is imbued with profound meaning and has this deep sense to it. Whereas you put him in copy paste suburbia, or you put him in the 7-Eleven, suddenly it strips that all away.
Yeah, it's reaching transcendence through aesthetics to an extent.
And I think you could also. Sorry, you're about to. I thought you'd finish.
Yeah, or just like sort of using that method of sort of like peering through the veil is kind of how I tend to think about it. So beauty is one of these things, I would say, that kind of like leads you towards some sense of like what the transcendental is, when you're sort of able to look somewhat beyond any kind of like false framing that you may have, because it's much harder to twist beauty in one way or another.
Yeah.
So this is my question then. So to actually reach this place where the actions that we do fit within the context and are this kind of natural expression of the heroic, how do we get to that point if we're in modernity? Do we need to just build something? Do we need to move or travel to a place that has these qualities that where the heroic just naturally arises from it? Maybe I'm putting too much pressure on just the environment and not the man himself needing to take action, but what do you guys make of that?
It's a very complicated problem, but that, of course, you could just say, oh, we just need to build everything like a neo-Gothic cathedral, but it's resources. It's dealing with the enemy at the same time, right? Going into the wild. But fundamentally, if we can at least understand the relationship between these things, what this is, it's the agent-arena relationship. The agent, St. George, has a context quite naturally that he fits into, which is where he is. He's meant for a certain context, a certain, what do you call it, an antagonistic context, but also the structure. The footballer has the arena. The footballer has equipment that all applies to it. The European should have neo-Gothic. This is what was the uprising of neo-Gothic in England, was trying to bring back the authentic being on all the structures we were building. I mean, certainly, when you realize this and you look around, you go, we should be building everything neo-Gothic right now. We should be doing that right now. And everything's utilitarian. It's disgusting. We used to, when they went to Australia, it was all built at Victorian age. They built it neo-Gothic. And this was an uprising, a response to this modernism. It didn't work in totality, but it helped, at least helped, right? So this Asian-arena relationship, you can see it even symbolically, right? I call it a hyper arena. So the hyper agent has a hyper arena. It's symbolically, say, the Greenwood. The Greenwood doesn't just apply to the pub. The Greenwood is also other things, right? A private club, right? So that's his context. So when you understand that, you go, okay, I want to be a hero. It's not just about enacting the procedures. You want to set up your environment to reinforce the very soul of the hero. Because if you don't have your house set up properly, if you don't have a chapel, how are you going to be a good Christian, right? You should have a little chapel or a place in your room that's like that, right? Jesus's context is the church, right? The church holds the spirit, the body is the church of Jesus, and the hyper agent of Jesus, God, right, is the spirit that moves the body around. It's the body, right? So, yeah, if we understand that, that's one help. But what do? We only have so many resources. Russia, I mean, so there's a bit to talk about Russia, but they were building these cathedrals, man. Have you seen these cathedrals dedicated to the armed forces? My God,
I was just about to bring up the like the Neo-Byzantine revival. Yeah,
and you hear it with You hear it with the Mechanicus theme.
Yeah.
New York.
Yeah, I've seen that. It's fucking glorious. Sorry, excuse my language. It's
the Moscow military cathedral. But yeah, I mean that's kind of an example of a different culture or a different civilization, perhaps even achieving that, or at least moving in the right direction towards it. So now we just sort of need to find that way of, and you can kind of tell it because it feels right.
Yes.
Even though we're not in that culture, you can kind of like sense a certain amount of feeling about it and a correctness about it. So now we find whatever that should be for us.
Well, I'm just realizing now.
There's another historical comparison, just quickly. Have you ever seen the alternative Gothic concepts, like concept drawings, the Gothic proposal for the Reichstag?
Yes, I have.
Yeah.
Oh, not the Reichstag. No.
No, yeah, the right. Yeah. So the Reichstag. There was another architect that was putting forward a proposal for a design for the Reichstag in Germany, and yeah, I dare say it looks a lot more appropriate to what Germany is compared to the sort of more.
It's Gothic, is it?
New. Sorry,
I guess Gothic, right? It's Gothic rather than classical, right?
Exactly. Yeah. But it's incredibly Gothic.
Yeah, I've seen some of the alternate drawings for Westminster, the Palace of Westminster. I've seen those ones, the alternate Gothic ones for that, and they're amazing. There's some that are much larger versions of that. But think about what's needed for that. You can only do it with the patronage of a king. You just can't. It's just too capitalistic. You need someone who has ultimate authority. You need an Arthur to rise to say, well, no, we're just going to pay for that. Is that you're going to pay for it. Say Mexico's going to pay for it. Like you're going to pay for it, right? You need a Chad King. I just don't see it, or at least an aristocracy who all are on the same board. So it'd have to be an alternate elite or a big man that comes in. I think you can do it on the smaller scale, right? You should put icons in your room. You should have these. I've got a cross here. You need these things around the context to imbue what you're doing, or it won't work unless you put the footballer in the arena. It's not going to work. I think you can do it on a small scale. It's hard though, isn't it? Because you see some of these guys going out to the wild, like Woodlander I had on my my podcast. How much money does it cost? It'd be pretty expensive to put some awnings. You could do it cheaply, do some smaller awnings on and different things on the structure. But usually people are going to think utilitarian. I was just speaking to an engineer who's a Greenwood member, very important engineer, actually, a high-tech engineer. And he is building, he's got more wealth though, right? So he can build a more traditional cabin out there. Whereas when he said the person down from him is a Scouse guy, right? And he's just used the most ratty stuff to make his building, the most cheapest art. And this is okay. I get people want to save money, but you don't really get the effect as much when you put this ratty modernist cabin out there. When you could just spend a bit more, but that's always going to assault us, isn't it? Oh, but can we afford it? So I don't know. I put on my wall, the work is ultimately for the sake of English being, folk and demos before economics. That's one thing that helps me. That's kind of Epicurean, I think. It's a proposition that constantly reminds me that for the sake of. So perhaps I will sacrifice more money for things. Because otherwise you will always go for the cheapest thing, won't you? Because of the way the utilitarian society's organized. So how do we overcome that? I don't know. An ultimate authority that says, bad luck, we're paying for it. Or try to do it on an individual basis. We do need yeah. What do you think of that?
Well, you Scott, in your podcast studio with the English manor in your backdrop, putting yourself into that context. I'm just kind of realizing now that is an expression. I mean, it's in a smaller scale, but it is one of those things that does imbue what you're doing in its proper context.
It does for you, but it's not. I mean, for me, this does, right? But this is a green screen, so I'm not. For the Age and Arena relationship, I'm not surrounded by the context of it. Nathan perhaps is close to actual castles, right? So. Yeah, it helps for the audience. I've imbued the set with this. So yes, I did it on purpose for the aesthetic of it. For me, it doesn't help me though. It helps everyone that watches. So you are right. It's an Asian arena relationship, but what we really do need is the real, of course, right? To view. That's why I've got the cross here. That's why I have, I've got these real things to. If I could afford it, this would be I can't afford it, right? But yeah, you are definitely right. in terms of the context, but just doesn't help me though. It's more for the audience who's watching.
My next stream is going.
Sorry, go. I just meant the tweed. The tweed is one thing. But yeah, sorry, go.
I was just going to say my next stream is going to take place from the ruins of Berwick Castle, where there is no electricity. But I'll find a way. I'll find a way, everybody. But yeah, I totally agree with this idea of you know, we were talking earlier about how the land and the spirit informed one another with the making of gardens, or that desire to make gardens. And then, well, we've spoken about this a lot, Scott, that your soul is not just cut off from the rest of the world and left untouched by what you do or what you interact with. It's very impressionable. It's like a wax waiting for stamps to come in on it. And everything around you is informing you, and everything you do is informing that and changing the direction of your being in one way or another. And I guess one thing I was thinking about, you know, agreeing with everything you've said about what we could do personally. I think on the broader scale, I think in part really believing and acting upon the idea that we don't live in this kind of global civilization. There is a boundary between the sanctuary and the wilderness. And if we really internalize that, then we start to understand, okay, what we're doing here is we're not just trying to change our society. We're trying to keep the sanctuary safe and to build the walls of the sanctuary. And I kind of think this is going to be a really banal analogy, but I remember listening to Carlo Ancelotti, who's probably one of the greatest football managers of all time. And he was talking about, how do I justify to my players that I drop them? You know, some of them I'm friends with. It's a painful thing to say you're not playing this week. Well, it's for the good of the team. And I can justify anything on the basis of, well, I like you, but I have to do this for the good of the team. With the idea of the sanctuary, it's for the good of the sanctuary. And there's that duty that you do it because that's your duty to protect the sanctuary. Whether you will be victorious or not, you have a duty to do that. And I think that gives a sense of conviction and purpose, which directs our actions then. Okay, so how do we go about protecting the sanctuary? We can actually think about that in various ways. So, okay, we might not be able to do the whole thing ourselves, but we can say, okay, there's a hole here. How do we fix that hole in the sanctuary wall? And maybe we could develop something, you know, a strategy for doing that, which is persuasive. And then, well, not even necessarily persuasive, because tying this background to St. George, what strikes me about the St. George story is that he doesn't take power, because, you know, the knight who conquers the dragon, you could think, well, he should be the leader. He is the hero. And for Carlyle, we admire and we obey and are loyal to the hero. They become the leaders of our societies. So St. George should be the leader in this situation, but he doesn't take that mantle. He doesn't usurp the king. He pushes the king in the right direction. He pushes society in the right direction through his virtuousness. He has that authority to direct it. And so there's almost a sense that if you're making yourself in trying to form that heroic in yourself, and you're providing the means to secure the walls, such as St. George does, then you need not lead. You can be like that knight who pushes King Charles in the right direction, for example. I don't say that it will be him for sure. I just mean,
no, you're right.
Do you see what I'm trying to get at?
No, you're 100% right, because that's why it's a hyper agent. That's why, because of course the king once was a hero, right? He once was a prince, black prince who went out too, right? And he embodied the hyper agent, and that hyper agent lives on after he goes back and becomes a king and embodies a different part of the pantheon of the heroes, right? So that's what I meant earlier when I said St. George is the expeditionary extension of the Overking, but it's not, you see, so it's the organism itself, but the king can't be that because he needs to rule. That is the eternal appendage of the expedition of the hero. So that completely fits with it. What you're saying, there's a reason why that logic doesn't work. the king can't be St. George, right? Because he can't be slaying dragons when he's ruling. And then we see this with Arthur. He sends out Gawain. Gawain is Arthur's extension. Arthur, he can be when he goes out on an expeditionary war, but that's very rare. It's very rare for that to occur. But yeah, Arthur once was a person that had to conquer the kingdoms as a St. George. When he begins to rule, he takes on the benevolent king, a different archetype, right? Richard himself embodies St. George when he goes out there. It's an expedition. When he comes back, he's no longer St. George, right? He's no longer that hyper agent. It goes on as an eternal archetype to make sure that we always have available the heroic masculine figure that goes out and does it. Because if it's abandoned, you never get the perfect society, do you? So you are 100% right with that. Yeah.
Nord Hugo, I saw that you had changed your environment for a second.
I made an attempt. The lighting did not match in the least. I think that's what works so much about Scots is the lighting fits within the context.
Well, I think we've probably got 10, 15 minutes because I'm going to, unfortunately, my brain is shutting down with tiredness. So but I want to give everybody a chance. If there's anything that you feel we should talk about with St. George before we go, and we will do remaining super chats before we go, so don't worry, folks. But yes, is there anything that we've not touched upon? St. George, Englishness, the state of the modern world. If there's anything in those broad categories we've not talked about that you really wanted to, please do raise it.
There is one thing, and I'll just see if I can bring it up. I just want to go to the English Heritage website, if I can see it here. Sorry, I don't want to ruin the stream by doing this, but I can quickly find it. Bring it down here. Anyway, I can't exactly find it so quickly enough to not interrupt the stream. But if you go to English Heritage website, they talk about St. George. They go through these 8 points, and they're all debunking. It's an attack on St. George. So I just wanted to say that, as you mentioned modernism, as the state of where we are, is that all our institutions are now attacking the great heroes, calling him a foreigner, essentially. And I hope today that we've articulated, or at least I articulated earlier, that it's a different thing. It's English. So when they say it's a foreigner, it's not. It's a particular hyper agent that's ours, that's here, that I think is different than other parts of it, even though it's been brought under, I understand that, the canon by picking that, but I think it's something in our being that chose it because it suits us, and I think I've reasonably articulated as individual to it. So to say that this historical person was born elsewhere just misunderstands what mythos is and misunderstands what hyperagents are, what distributed cognition is. That's all I wanted to say about it. St. George is English, born in England as a hyperagent. These idiots that do it are just trying to defeat you and undermine you. I'm sure we're all aware of that, but it's just important to articulate that English heritage is an enemy, part of the organism.
Is this the page you were meaning, Scott?
I have to look because I just turned off the where you are. I can't see the screen. Let me just get back to you and then full screen that. Yeah, that's it. And they go through it and they're just debunking it essentially. Whoa, who's the real St. George, right? They're looking for some human. Whereas St. George, even if you take the canon seriously, just talking about the Christian element of it, that person's in heaven now, and new things emerge out of the mythos that St. George went here and St. George went there. Well, yes, he did, as a hyper agent went there, right? So they say, oh, but the historical one didn't. Well, you don't get how it works. It's in heaven now, right? Just like Jesus as body is the church itself, it's in virtual. The mind has always been a microcosm of heaven. So even if you are a materialist, you could call it the unconscious, but it's always been there. So St. George is going to those places as a virtual spirit. Just so materialists understand what's going on with what the ancients thought about it, they understand that. You can articulate it as unconscious, but yeah. Anyway, that's all.
I'm also interested in the choice of fellow here. He looks a bit, to me, he looks like Daniel Fetterman. Does anybody else see that?
Downcast, he looks grim, a bit overweight. Interesting choice. English heritage. Very heroic.
Kind of displeased with being photographed at all. Yeah,
displeased. Oh, they debunked me. Oh, I guess there's nothing to England anymore, isn't it? That's what he looks like, depressed.
Rupert.
Yeah, there was sort of a through line to George that I was Saint George that I was going to sort of sketch out, but I think Scott did a much better job earlier and sort of took the wind out of my sails, because you sort of you did it in a much more sophisticated fashion. But I think there is also a sort of more direct, if still somewhat sort of spiritual tale that you can tell about how Saint George was sort of understood and portrayed, and it does lock in this sort of English quality in that. So you weren't very fond of the Richard I sort of third Crusade angle, where he supposedly took Saint George as a sort of patron saint during the course there, but the sort of way that the Crusade unfolded was kind of almost seen as like a vindication, like by my reading of like what Saint George represented and what was sort of accepted and what was approved of by God. And so that was sort of carried back and then used as a blueprint for what the later Order of the Garter would kind of try to exemplify to a great extent, because you have Richard I, who is himself steeped in all of these kind of like chivalric legends and whatever. And while he's on all the stories, and while he's on crusade, he essentially poses this open question to the divine and says, okay, within the frame of the warrior Saint George, how should I react? And then he's given approval for how he conducts himself, and so that is carried forward, and then that is then used as a model, carrying down not only to the Order of the Garter, but also to almost the entirety of England itself, especially to the knightly class, because that is then used as a blueprint for Englishness itself. And so you almost have like a reverse causality in a way where Englishness is kind of like molded around this divine, like sort of divinely approved of model of what is the correct conduct for an English knight, basically.
It sanctifies, really. So he goes there almost with an English way of being as a northerner. This is what the Crusades were. It's the Faustian man with his northern, his not so much barbarianism, but he sanctifies the English way of being. So there's a hyper agent there driving him down there, right? And it's not just Richard; there's other Englishmen with him. I know he's a Norman, but the Normans are very similar. And anyway, he's driven down there. So the hyper agent is then that's with them is deified, is brought into the canon in a way. What drove them down there is brought into the canon with St. George, who probably wasn't. I don't know if the dragon story existed then. I'm not sure, because this was before the earliest book that we know of that mentions the dragon story. I mean, no, it probably did. No, it would have. Anyway, so yeah, I agree with what you're saying. Were you saying that it was causally after, or more it was a sanctified, something that goes down with them and then is sanctified?
Well, obviously, whatever is sort of like inherent at that point to the Englishmen that are there is carried with them, and it depends on how much stock you put on that versus how much was sort of created, or not created whole cloth, obviously, but emphasized, you could perhaps say, by Edward III's sort of deliberate ethnogenesis.
Yeah.
But he's deliberately
a mix of both.
Yeah,
there'd be a certain emergent form of it, right? Because you probably have something that's more raw, that gets more chivalrized, right, by the Christian element. So there's probably a mix of both there, and brought into the canon. It's a way of bringing this way of being into the canon. So it is something that's native in us, I think. It needs to be, though, because you need a hyper agent, because you can't really pray to Arthur, can you? So you need Arthur to be a figure that's in the canon that can bless you, because you pray to St. George, and St. George then blesses you as a saint and helps you in battle. I don't think you can pray to, in the canon, you can't pray to Arthur, can you, to bless you, even though he's in heaven, so to speak. Yeah. So it's necessary to actually have a patron saint to actually support your country, and you can't use the one that is the formative figure. Yeah.
Though it was replacing a different patron saint, of course, Saint Edmund, I believe.
Yeah, there was Edmund the Martyr, and then there were the Saxon king who was killed fighting the Vikings during the period of Alfred. But then you also have the Edward the Confessor was also a kind of quasi patron saint as well.
Yeah.
So both figures who, well, the first one dies in battle. The second one is known for his prayerful life. But then you have the victorious knight who takes over that mantle, which I think is quite an interesting shift in mentality and spirit.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing I would emphasize is that it is. So even though Saint Edmund himself died in battle, there is like almost a greater emphasis put on the martial qualities, and that perhaps you could say reflects or is then magnified or magnifies rather the militarization of England itself, and that you have all these different factors coming together, both material, geopolitical, spiritual, all coming together to enhance this intense martial spirit.
Well, one thing I wanted to add, because you kind of brought in the Crusading context here, is I think the George and the Dragon story can be read very heavily as the Crusaders versus the Muslims and the kind of conquest of the Holy Land. For context, so the Battle of Antioch in 1098 is the first kind of reference to George appearing in crusading battle. And this was just after the Crusaders found the Holy Lance, so the lance or spear that pierced the side of Christ was found. And then they ride out to fight the Islamic forces. And a number of them, led by Bohemond, are surrounded or trapped or whatever. It looks like they're going to have a heroic last stand, right? So that northern heroic spirit coming through. But then 3 saints appear riding white horses: Saint George, Saint Demetrius, and I forget the last one. Matt, you're nodding your head. Do you have any idea?
Oh, just that this story of the Battle of Antioch is so reminiscent of Helm's Deep. It's this,
yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, definitely. So you have, and they lead other kind of knights, spiritual knights who in battle with the Crusaders, and they overcome the forces. And so bear that in mind, that you've got this connection of a spear with Saint George overcoming the pagan, the heathen, to reestablish, to build the garden back in Christendom, or reignite that within the Holy Land. Then come to where the setting of the St. George story is. Well, it's in Libya, right? So this would have been a part of the Islamic countries at that point, or Islamic peoples. It's not just pagan, it's Islamic. And then further with the dragon concept, well, the dragon was a symbol of the devil, the serpent being Draco. And often where depictions of Christ rising from the dead, what's he doing? He's crushing a dragon under his foot. So you're having all of this kind of strong symbolism of the Christian overcoming sin, the Christian overcoming the heathen, which kind of works in with the crusading mentality and the experience of the Crusaders. That's what they are doing. They are themselves fighting the dragon and trying to live in their own lives the St. George story, as it were. They are becoming St. Georges through their actions.
And we shouldn't underestimate, we should understand that they actually see. Don't think it's just written as a legend. They see St. George up there on the hill, right? They firstly, the way they see the world is symbolic. The way the world's to us is modern, so we don't see actual St. George on a hill, even though it is a distributed cognition amongst them all. Is that it will appear to them, and Jung talks about this, is that in moments of great upheaval and things that happened, even the modernists can see, but multiple people, heaps of stories of them seeing mythological figures out and around. So it's not just that. Rupert,
there's a good few examples of this. I just wanted to say in the modernist era, I think there's a few of them around World War One and a little bit after that as well. So I believe there were angels, I believe, seen on the around the Battle of Warsaw as well, when the Poles were fighting off the Bolsheviks.
That's not real. That's real in the sense that if you think symbolically speak, that's really there as a distributed cognition. It's there. That's why they see it. It's between them all, right? I mean, look, I can make ontological arguments for this. I'm not going to now because it would take forever. But let's not think about it's just in their head. No, all right. I'll make an argument at a different time, but yeah, just take it more seriously. Then it's just an illusion in their mind because that's in the ontology that you're in. So, yeah, that's all I'd say there.
Yeah, another more famous one actually was the Angels of Mons during World War I again, when there were, I believe, Agincourt era archers, longbowmen, protecting the British ranks against the Germans.
Yeah, I think there's other St. George ones too in World War One, maybe World War Two. Yeah, where you hear stories of that. Great empirical evidence to back it up. At least seeing it anyway. In the modern case. And think about it, if you think symbolically, that's even just understanding the world in a different way. It's just much more clear to them how these things work. And in fact, like I've said before, is that these are, in fact, better ways to more efficient ways to understand the world. It's now the symbolic way of thinking and the way the ancients saw the world is proving more useful than the quantitative for encompassing and predicting all-encompassing phenomena, like these categories, like the unknown, the St. George and the dragon. These now you can use these symbolic things to see the world, like you look on the internet. BAP, Bronze Age pervert, these are principalities that have a spirit to them, right? The woke parasite, it's a being, it's an organism between them all. And that can help you then predict it using this symbolic thinking. So it's not useless. It's not some form of mythology. It's not something that's just we're bringing up because of the stories. We like the stories. We want to tell it to children. No, it has a utility as well, especially these days.
Nordhuger, is there anything you wanted to bring up in the conversation before we finish up?
Sure. Yeah. Just to give kind of some last thoughts here. I'm gonna wake you out. I'm gonna rouse you out of this stupor there, Nathan. I'm gonna rouse
It's pretty late
here
now.
at the end. Yeah. Oh man, you poor guys across the.
Sorry, Nathan.
No, it's great. It's great. I asked for this.
But what is it about the story of St. George that, I mean, both on the English level, and just to what is it about it that's so convicting and so inspiring to men? And it's the radical conviction. It's what happens when a man completely abandons his fear of death, when he's willing to charge the most terrifying monsters there are head on. It's extraordinary, just the possibility that manifests, and it shows what it is to be the sort of warrior knight, both in a glorious life and in a glorious death, as the dragon slayer and as the martyr. It's embodying the full potential of Christian man, and it's a radical version of life, a radical version of Christianity. That it's none of this milquetoast sort of slop of half-hearted. Okay, we'll take what we're allowed to say here and not allowed to say there, and we'll go halfway on it. And that's no real true version of Christianity. Christ says, if you're neither hot nor cold, I'll spit you out of my mouth. If we're trying to present what it is to be a Christian, if we're trying to present what it is to be a man as this half-hearted, you can maybe be a little bit courageous here, but kind of back off there. If we're trying to present as this halfway thing, that's, maybe we'll get more people. Maybe we'll get people who want to just feel a little bit uncomfortable once in a while, but nothing beyond that. But that's not the point of Christianity. That's not the point of living as a knight. And I'm using the word knight more as like the goal and the level that we're trying to aspire to. And that's what we need to get back to is the St. George model. It's all right, we are going to face down death. We're going to face down the monsters. We're going to endure whatever persecutions and martyrdom will face us. And we'll do it, with complete confidence and courage that God will get us through. And death is no defeat. death is part of the path to glory, and not that it's the case for all of us to do that way. You know, what does Tolkien say that about a simple life? There's nothing. It's what. I'm forgetting
Yeah, it's
the
no
line.
small
But
thing to celebrate a simple life. Yeah, it's
Indeed,
not.
indeed.
And it's often the smallest person that moves the course of the future as well. But yeah, you're right. Not everyone has to do it. But sorry.
Right, and I mean, there is the place. I mean, if we're blessed, then we can have this life of where it's the everyday things that turn the tide of darkness. But on the other hand, too, I think we're increasingly coming to the place now in our time of history where maybe we're presented with a path that is more like St. George, where we do need to charge head on against the monsters that are ravaging our kingdoms.
Well, I mean, to the stream that we did recently, Nathan, we're kind of in and perhaps continuing to move through, or however you want to frame this, moving into an era of the possibility of great restorers and great restoration again. So we need to be understanding of the process, perhaps, and awake to the possibilities.
And being given form by these things, and that's what this is about. It's what I do, it's what Nathan does, what you guys are doing. It's we need to know the ancient knowledge if we want to be at the forefront of it. And for the people watching, it's an opportunity for people to be a part of this. Things are emerging, different community things, where in-person events, opportunities to be a part of hopefully a vanguard that are restorers, right? So it'll be hierarchical, but like England's always been, it's an opportunity for yeomen to rise through that. That's what this is. I'm not an aristocrat or anything like that. I'm just middle class. So I'm sure you guys as well. Right, and it's always been the way of being, and it's an opportunity. And you got to participate though, and answer the call. And that can start small. That can start by paying a union due or a membership or whatever, joining Nathan's channel, become a member or whatever it is. Come to basket weaving events and that sort of thing. So.
Guys, you've put it so beautifully, and I think that's a wonderful note to finish off on, that you can be a part of the restoration. That is something that I think people can take hold of and think about for themselves. If they take anything away, think about it, feel about it, and then act upon it. We have one further super chat from Lady of Shalott for $2 The charge of the Light Brigade, Tennyson said it. I think that was in reference to, you were speaking earlier about doing your duty, not to ask why about it, just to, and not for reward or gain.
Do or die.
Yeah, to do or die. So thank you, Lady of Shalott, and thank you, Enriab, for your earlier super chat. Gentlemen, is there anything that you would like to promote before we go? Scott.
Oh, me. Yeah, just Google my name and you'll find my channel there. And there's probably, I suppose, relevant to this, perhaps something we've spoken about is just my video. It'll come up. It's the first thing that'll play. It's just about the metaphysics of Tweed. It's about the contact of the arena, and the equipment is connected to the context in the arena of the agent, and how that's important to the very getting into the way of being. So that's what that's about, related to what we're talking about. The video of how these folk things and how it's equipment, right? Equipment's part of the context, part of the arena, like we mentioned earlier. So why that's important metaphysically. That's it. Yeah, just my channel. Google, look my Scott Mannion name, and it'll come up.
I think that's possibly my favorite video ever. Like, that is just, just love that video.
Great.
It's because at first you think, okay, what can he possibly say about tweed suits, right?
Yeah.
But you show how much meaning there is in the tweed suit, and I was just like, wow, this is just brilliant. Everybody has to watch this. So yes,
you can get more out of, there's more in things than people realize, right? When you find the right things, when you have an intuition for something, you go, there's something in this, keep following that. You can metaphysically unpack it when you do.
Yeah.
You wouldn't have had that response if there wasn't something in it. It would just feel inauthentic if I was just making it up or some shit. The reason why you respond like that is because some things have that depth to them and we've ignored them for so long. But sorry, anyway, we've talked enough.
No, Thank you, Scott, and thank you for coming on again. And everybody, check out his channel. Matt, anything you'd like to promote?
Yeah, no, that's. I've got a YouTube channel, but yeah, be sure to check out Nathan, Scott, Rupert. What I love about the content of these guys is it has an animating quality to it. It's not just you're hearing the stories, but then it's also getting to this layer of application, and that's something that there's too much just kind of idle chatter. So it's refreshing to get back to a place of, all right, we're gonna talk and unpack these stories and these ancient mythology, but all right, what does this mean for us, and how do we actually take action and take inspiration from it?
Oh, most definitely. I think the example I always think of, there's two, they're interrelated, is one, and they're both to do with kind of movies. You'll see, like, you get, like, in Star Wars, you get the lore channels, and it's like, why did Yoda have a green lightsaber? Or why did Mace Windu wear brown boots instead of black boots? And I'm being a bit facetious, but, like, that's the kind of thing. It's like, okay, here's a fact about Star Wars that you didn't know before, and it's kind of interesting, but it doesn't, like, it. That's not why you watch Star Wars, right? That's not why it really appeals to you. And you probably could say something about the meaning of a green lightsaber, which does say something about the nature of color and what it's saying to you and what it says about that character and so on. But it's very on the surface. But the other one is like the movie critic who kind of deconstructs all of the woke movies today and says, this is what's wrong with it. This is what's wrong with it. But there's no kind of like, okay, where do we go from here apart from back to the 90s or something like that? Whereas what you're saying, Nordhuger, and I think your channel really does this as well, is that there's something in these things which animate us anyway, and we're just, by touching upon them, you then are able to intensify that very thing which was responding in the first place. So yeah, everybody check out Nordhuger's channel. It's absolutely fantastic. Very underrated. And hopefully we'll get you some more subscribers in due course. And finally, Rupert, anything you would like to promote?
Probably fairly similar thing, really. Just Google my name and have a look at anything you find. At this point, I'm mostly popping on streams, but most of the appearances are very good conversations. I'd probably go as far as to say all. So yeah, everything that's on this channel that we've done together, the 2 streams I've done with Semiagog, also quite good, I would say. Similarly, I'm always trying to approach things like history with an eye to trying to draw out sort of like inspirational heroic figures and trying to sort of like reignite a heroic spirit by seeing a model of how that plays out. But also trying to, from the systemic side of things, trying to understand, okay, there were other people in various positions like ours in the past, and what did they do to navigate it, either successfully or unsuccessfully, and trying to draw out some implicit lessons of that. So if that sounds interesting to you, then have a look at my Twitter, have a look at my writings on Praxarchy and elsewhere. Have a look at the streams.
I definitely think people should check out your articles on Praxarchy. I think for me, reading them is some of the most informative content I come across, because because of what you're saying, you're not just bringing the kind of championing the heroic spirit or character, but you're then relating it to real historical examples and what lessons we could draw on a political level from those. So I definitely think those are worth consulting. And I should say as well, I don't know if people know this, but the very foundation of the English Restoration series that we've been doing came from your speech at the Witten, Rupert, because you were basically articulating many of these ideas at the Shielding conference, and I think it was the first time that several of us in the audience had heard somebody say that in a modern context about restoration. And if I remember rightly, it got like a number of people gave a standing ovation, and mainly the English people in the audience, actually. So that was the genesis. That was what planted the seeds in my brain for this. So I have a lot to thank you for, Rupert, on that front.
You're very kind. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to wrap up with a poem that somebody sent me. His name's Michael. He's on Twitter, and it's based on the kind of his perceptions on St. George, and I think there's many things within it which relate to what we've been talking about. But before I read it, let me just say thank you again to my three wonderful guests. Thank you to all of you who have been watching in the chat, and I wish everybody a very happy St. George's Day, or what's left of it. So here is Michael's poem. In simpler days, we never dwelled on myths that we had heard. The tales of demons, ghouls, and orcs seemed patently absurd, for in our more enlightened time we shunned what wasn't seen, denied that evil could exist, except in foolish dreams. But as the years, then decades passed, the land we knew had gone. One night the sun grew down for dusk, but never since has shone. We found ourselves in constant dark with demons all around, and overhead a dragon looms, his hiss a ceaseless sound. With demons we'd sworn to be controlling all our lives, and the dragon proving overhead that he still survives. We know now evil does exist. Its rise has been achieved, but if the evil tales were true, what else must be believed? Now quiet corners have been formed where brave men come to tell the tale of England's patron saint, which years of lies have quelled. The story told was of a man whose face was marred in pain, for he knew that the dragon slain would rise and rise again. So in his prayers he pled to God to summon forth a crowd, to watch him as he battled with the courage God allowed. In front of the befuddled mob, St. George raised up his shield. A Christian cross was painted red. His faith had been revealed. The peasants watched him as he plunged his lance into the dragon, and when the beast fell to the ground, they praised St. George's passion. But George, the storyteller told, refused their mindless praise. Instead, he said, "Be one with Christ, and he will keep you safe." Then as St. George rode off upon his heaven-given horse, the crowd then knelt before the Lord and prayed to right their course. Lord, give us strength as we accept the faith that we must forge, and guide us as we draw upon the spirit of St. George.